In the vast wilderness of the northern forests, where the land stretches endlessly under a mantle of snow and the trees groan in the grip of frost, there exists a silence unlike any other. It is not the soft quiet of a spring meadow or the stillness of a summer's night. It is a silence born of absence, of life retreating from the crushing weight of winter. The rivers are locked beneath unyielding ice. The animals vanish into burrows and dens, conserving every precious scrap of energy. The air itself becomes brittle, snapping in the lungs with each breath, carrying the sharp bite of temperatures that turn exposed skin raw in moments. This land is not gentle. It is not forgiving. It is a world where survival itself is a negotiation with forces far older and more ruthless than humanity. The Algonquin-speaking peoples who have called these forests home for countless generations understood this reality intimately. Their stories, their rituals, and their lives were bound to the cycles of the seasons and, above all, to the long reign of winter. It was in this frozen landscape, among the skeletal trees and the howling winds, that one of the most fearsome figures of indigenous North American folklore took shape, the Wendigo. To speak its name in the dead of winter was to stir unease, to remind the community of dangers both natural and supernatural. It was a creature of hunger and greed, a monster said to stalk the woods during times of famine, devouring human flesh and never being satisfied. But before it became the terrifying figure that would later haunt the imagination of outsiders, it was part of a lived cultural system, a symbol and warning woven into the very survival strategies of those who endured the harsh northern climate. To understand the Wendigo, we must first understand the land that birthed it. Winter in the north was not merely a season, it was a trial by ordeal. The snow could bury the earth in layers so deep that even the strongest hunter might struggle to move. The cold could seep into the bones, gnawing slowly until exhaustion became fatal. When hunting failed and supplies ran thin, starvation was not an abstraction, but a reality that could decimate entire families. In such conditions, hunger took on a presence of its own. It was not just a feeling in the stomach, it was a voice whispering in the mind, urging desperate choices, stripping away the civility and bonds that held communities together. And in those moments, when the line between survival and morality blurred, the figure of the Wendigo loomed as both warning and possibility. The people of these lands believed that the Wendigo was not merely a monster lurking in the shadows, but a spirit of insatiable hunger. It could seize hold of a person, warping them from within, twisting their humanity until all that remained was a gaunt, ravenous shell.
The individual became something other than human, condemned to roam the forest, driven only by the need to consume. This was not just a story for frightening children. It was a cultural mechanism, a way of giving shape to the fear that hunger could turn even the most loved family member into something monstrous. Imagine a village in midwinter, deep in the forests of what is now Ontario, Quebec, or Minnesota. The snow has fallen endlessly for weeks. The game has vanished, driven south or hidden deep. The caches of dried fish and smoked venison that were carefully prepared during the summer months have run out. The people huddle around dwindling fires, their bodies thinner, their eyes hollow. A father looks at his children and feels the desperation claw at his chest. And then he thinks of the old stories, of those who gave in to hunger in its most terrible form, of those who broke the ultimate taboo and ate the flesh of their kin, of those who were said to have become Wendigo. The Wendigo is not simply a beast waiting in the trees, it is hunger personified, the human capacity for greed and desperation pushed beyond its limits. In this sense, the environment and the folklore are inseparable. The crushing winters of the north made starvation an ever-present possibility. The Wendigo became the embodiment of that danger, a reminder that survival was not only a matter of physical endurance but also of moral strength. To eat another human being, even in the most desperate circumstances, was to cross a threshold that could never be undone. The person who did so was no longer themselves. They belonged to the Wendigo. But there is more. The Wendigo was not only a warning against cannibalism, but also against greed of every kind. In some versions of the stories, the Wendigo grows larger with every meal, its body expanding grotesquely, its hunger always increasing. No matter how much flesh it consumes, it is never satisfied. It is doomed to endless starvation. This detail is crucial because it transforms the Wendigo from a simple tale of winter survival into something much deeper. It is not only about the danger of eating human flesh, it is about the danger of excess, of consuming more than one needs, of allowing greed to overwhelm the balance of life in a harsh environment where every resource is precious. When we imagine the Wendigo's forest, it is not a lush woodland filled with abundance. It is a skeletal landscape where every tree stands stark against the snow, every sound carries for miles, and every living thing is struggling simply to endure. This is the stage upon which the Wendigo appears, a place where hunger itself can feel like a living presence pressing in on the people, where the whisper of the wind through the branches can sound like a voice calling out from the shadows, where footprints in the snow that lead nowhere can trigger fear that something not quite human is moving nearby. The Wendigo, then, was never only a physical monster, it was an explanation for what happens when human beings are pushed beyond their limits. It was a way to articulate the fear that in the depths of starvation, people could lose themselves, their humanity, and become something else entirely. And in this frozen wilderness, that fear was never far away. The silence of the northern winter is deceptive. It feels still, but it is a silence pregnant with threat. Every crack of ice, every snap of a branch could be the signal of something approaching. The Wendigo was said to move with a terrible swiftness, gliding through the trees despite its emaciated form. Its eyes burned like fire in the sockets of a skull-like face. Its breath froze in the air, carrying the stench of death. Those who saw it rarely lived to tell the tale. But the descriptions that survived paint a creature of contradictions, both skeletal and impossibly strong, both gaunt and towering, a figure that looked like a starving man stretched into something inhuman. But before we can describe its features in more detail, we must linger here in the forest, because the environment itself is as much a character in the Wendigo legend as the creature. Without the crushing weight of winter, without the very real possibility of hunger and starvation, the Wendigo would not exist.
It was born of the land, and it cannot be separated from it. To step into the frozen woods of the north is to step into its domain. And so, when people gathered around the fire, huddled in their furs while the wind howled outside, they told stories of the Wendigo. Not to entertain, not to pass the time, but to remind themselves of the dangers lurking just beyond the glow of the flames. The Wendigo was always watching, always waiting for weakness. Hunger could drive a person into its grasp, greed could summon it closer, and once it took hold, there was no turning back. The Wendigo's story is not only about the supernatural, it is about the thin line between civilization and savagery, between restraint and indulgence, between survival and damnation. It asks the question, what would you do when faced with starvation in the heart of winter? Would you endure, or would you fall to hunger's whispers and become something monstrous? This is why the silence of the northern forests is never empty. It is filled with memory, with fear, and with the presence of the Wendigo. And as we move deeper into these woods, we will come closer to its form, to the first sightings, and to the descriptions that turned hunger into a monster that still haunts our imagination today.
The stories of the Wendigo were not confined to whispers around the fire. They took form in encounters, in reports, and in the memories of those who claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. In the endless white expanse of the northern forests, sightings became part of the oral tradition, spreading from village to village, carried by hunters, shamans, and travelers who had crossed into places where the human world thinned and something older seemed to step forward. The descriptions were never identical, but certain details returned again and again until the Wendigo's image became etched into the collective imagination of the Algonquin-speaking peoples and, later, into the writings of outsiders who recorded these stories with equal parts fascination and dread. The creature was almost always described as gaunt, its skin stretched tightly over protruding bones. Some said its flesh was grey, tinged with the frost of endless winter. Others spoke of a figure whose body seemed half decayed, as if it were not entirely alive but held together by something other than natural vitality. Its lips were torn away or absent, leaving a gaping mouth filled with jagged, blood-stained teeth. The eyes glowed with a terrible light, sometimes described as burning embers, sometimes as the pale glimmer of ice that catches the moonlight. It was human and not human, familiar enough to terrify, alien enough to be unmistakable. Size was another detail that shifted from tale to tale.
In some accounts, the Wendigo was a towering giant, its height stretching impossibly tall, as if hunger itself had warped its body, elongating its limbs into grotesque proportions. It loomed above the trees, its head swaying like a predator searching for prey. In other accounts, it was smaller, closer to the size of a man, but no less terrifying, for its emaciated form spoke of a hunger that could never be satisfied. The contradiction was part of its terror. The Wendigo was both immense and skeletal, both impossibly strong and pitifully thin. It was a living paradox, and its very existence defied the logic of the natural world. The earliest sightings were not recorded in written language, but passed down orally, shaping generations. Hunters spoke of strange tracks in the snow, footprints larger than any man's, stretching out in impossible strides, disappearing without warning into places where the snow was undisturbed. They described hearing an unnatural sound carried on the wind, a mournful cry that echoed across frozen lakes and through the trees. It was not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between, a wail of hunger that seemed to pierce the marrow of the listener's bones. Some claimed to see it at the edge of vision, a gaunt figure moving silently between the trees, always just beyond the reach of the firelight.
Others told of more direct confrontations, of a hunter who found himself stalked for days by an unseen presence, his supplies vanishing, his strength failing, until finally he caught a glimpse of something watching him from the tree line. By the time he returned to his village, he was gaunt himself, convinced that the Wendigo had nearly claimed him. These stories spread not as entertainment but as warnings. The Wendigo was not a legend to be admired. It was a threat that shaped behavior. The Jesuit missionaries who arrived in the 17th century recorded some of the earliest written references to the Wendigo. They wrote of the Algonquin people, describing a spirit that drove men to acts of cannibalism, a presence of the forest that embodied insatiable hunger. Their records, though filtered through European frameworks of religion and morality, give us glimpses of how widespread the belief was. One missionary in 1636 noted that the Wendigo was said to infect people during famine, turning them into monsters with an appetite for human flesh. Another described a case in which a man who confessed to being haunted by Wendigo desires was executed by his own community, not out of cruelty, but as an act of protection. These early accounts reveal the seriousness with which the Wendigo was regarded. This was not a distant myth told for amusement. It was a lived reality that influenced decisions about life and death. If someone was suspected of being overtaken by the Wendigo spirit, drastic measures were often taken. Communities could not risk the presence of such a being among them, for hunger, once it became embodied in this way, was thought to be contagious. The physical descriptions also tell us something about how the Wendigo was understood. Its skeletal form mirrored the image of starvation itself. The human body wasting away in famine looks like the Wendigo, bones jutting beneath the skin, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken. In times when whole communities suffered from lack of food, the Wendigo was a way of making sense of the sight of starvation, of externalizing the horror into a supernatural figure. But the glowing eyes, the torn mouth, the towering frame, these details transformed it into more than a reflection of hunger. They made it an entity that was not only a warning, but also an active force, stalking and hunting those who strayed too far into the wilderness. It is telling that the Wendigo was often said to appear in winter, during the months when food was scarce and the dangers of famine most acute. The deep cold itself became part of the creature's identity. Some said its heart was made of ice, others believed its breath froze everything it touched. Its very being was tied to the season of death, when the world lay under snow and survival hung by a thread. To see the Wendigo was to feel the embodiment of winter's merciless hunger staring back. There were also reports of transformation. A person who gave in to cannibalism, whether through desperation or through greed, was said to become a Wendigo. This was not merely symbolic. To those who believed, it was literal. The act of consuming human flesh invited the spirit of the Wendigo inside, warping the person's body and soul until they were no longer human. Their appetite became uncontrollable, their body twisted into the grotesque form of the monster. In this sense, the first sightings were not always of something that had existed forever, lurking in the forest. Sometimes they were of people, neighbors or kin, who had crossed the boundary of taboo and become something else entirely. This transformation was the most terrifying possibility of all, for it meant that anyone could become Wendigo. The creature was not an external predator alone. It was a potential hidden inside every person, waiting for the moment of desperation to emerge. This belief ensured that stories of sightings carried a double weight. To see a Wendigo in the woods was frightening enough. To suspect that someone within the village might be turning into one was worse. It meant the monster was not only outside the firelight, but inside the circle of trust. These ideas were not only preserved in indigenous oral tradition, but also fascinated European chroniclers and later folklorists. By the 19th century, tales of the Wendigo had spread beyond indigenous communities and entered the imagination of settlers, scholars, and eventually writers. But the earliest sightings remain the most haunting because they were not dressed up in Gothic language or sensational detail. They were stark, simple accounts rooted in lived fear, a gaunt figure glimpsed between trees, strange tracks in the snow, the sound of a mournful cry across the frozen night. And yet, for all the horror, the Wendigo was also understood as a teacher. To speak of its sightings was to remind people of the dangers of greed, of hunger, of isolation. It was a story that kept communities vigilant, discouraging acts that could bring ruin. If the Wendigo was seen, it meant someone had gone too far, someone had taken more than they needed, or someone had broken the balance that allowed survival in such a harsh environment. The creature of bones and frost, then, was not only a phantom of the forest, but also a mirror. It reflected the stark realities of winter and the choices that hunger forced upon human beings. To understand its sightings is to understand how myth and environment intertwined, how the people of the North gave shape to their deepest fears in the figure of the Wendigo. And as the stories grew, as they passed from one voice to another, the image of the gaunt giant solidified until it became one of the most enduring monsters of North American folklore. But knowing what it looked like is only the beginning. To grasp its full meaning, we must turn to its name, to the word itself, and trace the origins of what it meant to call something Wendigo. For in the name lies the first step toward understanding how a people defined hunger as a spirit that could never be satisfied. The image of the creature is terrifying, but the name itself carries its own weight. To speak it aloud is to invoke something far older than the written word, a term that has shifted in sound and shape across different Algonquin-speaking peoples, each variation carrying shades of meaning that tell us not only about the monster, but also about the cultural world that defined it. Before it became the subject of anthropological notes or Gothic fiction, it was a word whispered in winter, a word that condensed fear, hunger, and spiritual danger into a single syllable: Wendigo. The difficulty in tracing the exact origin of the name lies in the vastness of the Algonquin language family. From the Ojibwe to the Cree, from the Innu to the Saulteaux, each group had its own pronunciation and its own nuance. Some said Windigo, others Wendigo, Witiko, Wiendigo, or Windikook. To outsiders, these looked like separate terms, but within their original contexts, they were recognized as variations on a theme, the same word filtered through different tongues. Each version, however, retained the core association: a being of hunger, a presence of winter, a devouring spirit that transformed men into monsters. Linguists have long debated the precise etymology. Some scholars trace it to a Proto-Algonquian root meaning owl or screech owl, linking the creature to the eerie sounds of night in the forest. Others suggest it derives from terms associated with excess, famine, or cannibalism. Still others argue that it stems from a root word meaning spirit of evil, or the one who devours. What is clear is that no single English translation captures the depth of the term. To reduce it to cannibal spirit is too narrow, to render it as evil spirit is too broad. The word existed in a linguistic and cultural matrix where hunger, winter, greed, and taboo converged. The Ojibwe word windigu, for instance, carries connotations not only of cannibalism, but also of corruption, a sense of something unnatural and monstrous taking over a person. The Cree variation Witikau emphasizes the destructive aspect, a being that wastes and destroys. Innu versions stress the idea of a giant, tying the concept to a creature that towers over humans in both scale and appetite. Each version reveals a different facet of the same terror, and together they sketch the outline of a figure that is both physical monster and spiritual condition. The fact that the name varies but remains recognizable across such a wide geographical area tells us something important. This was not a local myth confined to one isolated group. It was a shared cultural warning spread across thousands of miles of forest, lake, and tundra. The Wendigo was a pan-Algonquin presence, and the name itself served as a unifying marker. To speak it was to remind everyone of the dangers that hunger posed, no matter which dialect you spoke or which hunting grounds you called home. When European missionaries and explorers first encountered the term, they struggled to record it accurately. The Jesuits transcribed it as Windigo, sometimes even as Windikook. Later, fur traders and settlers picked up versions like Witiko or Wendigo. Each time the word passed through the filter of another language, it was reshaped slightly, but the core remained. Over time, Wendigo became the most common English spelling, the one that endured into literature and popular culture. But behind that familiar arrangement of letters lies a far more complex and fluid reality. The name itself functions almost like a spell. It is not just a label but a warning, a way of calling attention to a condition that threatens both body and soul. In Algonquin oral tradition, to name something is to acknowledge its presence, to give it reality. To say Wendigo is to admit that hunger can consume a person from within, that greed can warp the human spirit into something monstrous. It is a word that carries a moral charge, and to invoke it carelessly was to invite unease. There are also accounts of people who were said to be Wendigo, not because they transformed into the towering giant, but because they displayed behaviors associated with insatiable greed or cannibalistic desire. In these cases, the name was applied to human beings as a way of marking them as dangerous, as infected by the spirit of hunger. The word could condemn, and in some cases it did. Those accused of being Wendigo might be exiled or even executed, their death seen not as murder, but as protection against the spread of a spiritual disease. The name had power not only in myth, but in law, shaping the boundaries of what a community could tolerate. Over time, as outsiders began to write about the legend, the name became untethered from its original linguistic context. Writers in the 19th and 20th centuries treated it as the name of a monster, a North American equivalent to the werewolf or vampire. But within its original framework, it was never just a monster. It was a condition, a fate, a warning. The name pointed to a complex network of beliefs about hunger, morality, and the thin line between human and inhuman. It is also worth noting that the name has survived. Unlike many indigenous terms that were erased or replaced under colonial pressure, Wendigo has remained a recognizable word in English for centuries. This persistence speaks to the strength of the concept and to the resonance of the sound itself. Wendigo is not a soft word. It is harsh, its syllables edged like frost, its vowels echoing like the wind through bare branches. To say it feels almost like exhaling in cold air, the breath turning visible as it leaves the mouth. Even for those unfamiliar with its history, the sound carries menace. It feels like a name that should not be spoken too often. This endurance also reflects the adaptability of the legend. As the word traveled into new contexts, it gained new meanings. For some, it became a shorthand for greed in general, applied metaphorically to describe those who consume resources without limit. For others, it remained tied to cannibalism, a taboo so powerful that even the hint of it invoked horror. For still others, especially in literature and popular culture, it became a monster of the northern wilderness, stalking lonely travelers and devouring the lost. In every case, the word retained its association with hunger that could not be sated. But before it became a literary symbol or a cinematic monster, it was a word spoken around the fire in the depth of winter, a reminder of what could happen if the balance of life was broken. It was a name that contained both fear and instruction. Fear because to become Wendigo was to lose everything human. Instruction because to avoid becoming Wendigo was to remember restraint, to share resources, to resist greed even when hunger pressed hardest. The word was both curse and cure, both a threat and a reminder of the values that sustained life in the harsh north. Tracing the name back through time, across dialects and translations, we see that it is less a single definition and more a constellation of meanings. Cannibal, giant, evil spirit, hunger, greed, destruction, all of these orbit the word, none of them capturing it completely. The Wendigo is not reducible to a single English word because it is not only a creature, it is a worldview condensed into sound, a cultural truth given voice. And so, when we speak of the Wendigo today, we must remember that the name carries with it centuries of meaning, a weight of survival and morality forged in the cold forests of the north. To say it is to acknowledge hunger as more than a bodily need. It is to recognize it as a force that can consume not just flesh, but humanity itself. Understanding the name is the first step toward understanding the being. But the legends did not stop with a word. They grew into stories, tales passed down across generations, each one layering new detail onto the core warning. To truly grasp the Wendigo, we must listen to those tales, the fireside narratives of the Algonquin peoples who first gave it form, and see how the word became a living legend. The northern forests were never silent places of empty superstition. They were living landscapes filled with voices, and the people who lived there understood the forest, the rivers, and the seasons as part of a world alive with spirit. Around the fire, as snow pressed against the sides of the lodge and the wind moaned through the trees outside, the Wendigo appeared not only as a word, but as a living story. These were not simple entertainments meant to pass the long hours of winter. They were instructions, warnings, and reminders wrapped in the language of myth. The tales told by the Algonquin peoples, especially the Cree, Ojibwe, and Innu, reveal how deeply the Wendigo was embedded in the fabric of life and how it functioned as a guide as much as a terror. Imagine a circle of listeners in the dim orange glow of firelight. The air inside is heavy with smoke, the warmth is fragile, and outside the night stretches into darkness so complete that the boundaries of the world seem to vanish. This was the stage on which the Wendigo came alive. An elder, carrying memory in his voice, would begin. He might start with a tale of famine, of a time when the game had vanished, when snow buried the land deeper than memory, and when families huddled together to survive on scraps of bark and marrow. Hunger was not an abstract villain. Everyone in the room knew its gnawing persistence. It was in that shared experience that the Wendigo's legend was rooted. One tale told of a hunter who strayed too far in search of food. His family waited for him, but days turned into weeks, and when he returned, he was not the same. His eyes glowed with a strange light, his voice rasped with a hunger that words could not satisfy. He confessed he had eaten human flesh to survive, and in doing so, he had become Wendigo. From that moment, he was no longer kin. He was something else, cursed to roam the forest endlessly, his body wasted and his spirit hollow. The family fled, for to stay was to risk being devoured by the creature their loved one had become. Another story warned of people who ignored the balance of sharing. In times of plenty, they hoarded food, hiding it away while their neighbors starved. When famine came, these hoarders were said to attract the spirit of the Wendigo. Their greed made them vulnerable, and they transformed into creatures of insatiable appetite. The lesson was clear. Survival in the North depended on community. To take more than one's share was not only selfish but dangerous. It opened the door to the Wendigo. There were also tales of shamans who battled the Wendigo in the spiritual realm. These stories painted the monster not just as a creature of flesh, but as a powerful spirit that could be confronted by those trained in medicine and ritual. A shaman might fast for days, entering a trance, seeking visions that would allow him to identify who in the community was being touched by the Wendigo's hunger. Through ceremony, song, and offerings, he would attempt to drive out the spirit before it took hold completely. These accounts remind us that the Wendigo was never only a predator in the woods. It was also an internal danger, a sickness of the soul that required spiritual medicine. In some legends, the Wendigo was described as a giant of ice, towering above the trees, its heart frozen solid. In others, it was lean and skeletal, barely more than skin and bones, but moving with uncanny swiftness. These contradictions did not weaken the story. They made it more powerful because they emphasized the Wendigo as a shapeshifter, a being that reflected the fears of the moment. In times when famine was the greatest threat, the Wendigo appeared emaciated. In times when greed was the focus, it appeared bloated, a giant swollen with excess. The Wendigo was not fixed, it was as changeable as hunger itself. The stories also carried an important theme of justice. Many tales ended with the Wendigo being destroyed, not by human strength alone, but by forces greater than it. Fire was often the weapon of choice, for flame represented life, warmth, and renewal, the direct opposite of the Wendigo's icy hunger. In some cases, a Wendigo was lured into a trap and burned until nothing remained but ash. In others, a shaman called upon spiritual allies to defeat it, proving that the community, armed with tradition and respect for the natural order, could overcome even the most terrifying of spirits. The legends were not uniform. Among the Cree, the Wendigo often appeared as a warning tied explicitly to famine and cannibalism. Among the Ojibwe, it could also be a figure of greed more generally, an embodiment of imbalance that threatened to tear apart the harmony of the world. Among the Innu, It was sometimes described as an enormous figure of the tundra, stalking the open spaces as much as the forests. These variations reflect the landscapes and survival challenges of each people. But across them all, the Wendigo remained a presence tied to hunger, greed, and the consequences of losing balance. There is one detail that recurs often enough to demand attention: the Wendigo's voice. Many tales describe it as calling out in the night, mimicking the cries of humans in distress. Travelers who followed the sound, believing they were rescuing a lost companion, were said to walk straight into the creature's grasp. The voice was both lure and trap, a reflection of the way hunger itself can deceive. What sounds like relief or promise can lead to destruction. To hear the Wendigo calling was to be reminded not to trust every desire, not to follow every craving, for some paths end only in ruin. Another common motif is the expansion of the Wendigo's body. Each time it consumed a human, it grew larger, its frame stretching, its limbs lengthening, but its stomach remained hollow. This grotesque growth symbolized the futility of greed. The more it ate, the hungrier it became.
The bigger it grew, the more empty it felt. Here, the Wendigo becomes less a predator and more a metaphor. The endless hunger of winter, the endless hunger of the human heart when unrestrained by community, the endless hunger of a world where nothing is ever enough. Children listening to these stories by the fire would not simply hear about a monster. They would absorb the rules of survival, share food, respect balance, beware of greed. Do not wander too far into the woods alone. Respect the power of hunger, for it can change you. In this way, the Wendigo was part of education as much as belief. It taught the young what words alone could not enforce, that the greatest danger in winter was not only the cold, but the possibility that desperation could tear apart the bonds of kinship and turn humans into something inhuman. The legends also served another purpose. They gave the people a way to speak about trauma. Starvation, cannibalism, and isolation were not abstract possibilities. They were real experiences in the harsh climate of the North. By framing these horrors in the figure of the Wendigo, communities could talk about them, remember them, and pass on the lessons without directly reliving the pain. The Wendigo carried the burden of those memories, holding them in myth so that the people could carry forward the knowledge without being crushed by the weight of despair. And so, when outsiders later recorded these stories, they often missed the point. To European ears, the Wendigo was simply a monster tale, a frightening legend of the wilderness. But to the Algonquin peoples, it was a living system of meaning. It was not just a beast, but a warning, a teacher, a reminder of the values that kept communities alive through winter's cruelty. To reduce it to a monster is to strip it of its purpose. To listen to it as the people did is to understand hunger not only as a physical condition, but as a moral and spiritual trial. The stories told by the fire made the Wendigo more than a figure of fear. They made it part of the moral landscape, a presence that reminded every listener of the fragility of human life and the strength required to protect it. Each tale wove the creature deeper into the fabric of survival until it was impossible to imagine winter without it. The Wendigo was not only out there in the trees, it was in the stories, in the warnings, in the lessons passed from generation to generation. But to understand the Wendigo fully, we must go beyond the legends themselves and look at what they reveal about human experience. Hunger is not only about food, it is about desire, about the boundaries between need and excess, about the choices that shape whether communities endure or collapse. The Wendigo became the spirit of hunger, not because people feared starvation alone, but because they recognized that hunger, unchecked, could destroy everything. And in that recognition, they gave it a name, a story, and a form that has endured to this day. From the glow of the fire, the tales spread into the cold night, carried by memory and word.
each retelling binding the Wendigo tighter into the imagination of the North. But to see its face most clearly, we must look directly at the embodiment of hunger itself, at how famine and cannibalism shaped not only the legend, but the very survival of the people who told it.
Starvation is not a distant fear in the lands where the Wendigo was born. It was an ever-present reality, pressing against the lives of those who lived in the northern forests. To modern ears, the word famine often sounds abstract, as if it belongs to history books or distant places. But for the Algonquin-speaking peoples, hunger was as immediate as the snow outside the lodge. When hunting failed, when the fish did not bite, when a sudden storm buried the land in ice, hunger came creeping into the village like a shadow. It hollowed out cheeks, thinned limbs, and dimmed eyes until even the strongest men and women became fragile before its weight. It is difficult for us now, surrounded by abundance, to grasp what starvation truly meant. Food was not a guarantee. Every season was a gamble, and the long winters stretched those gambles to the breaking point. A miscalculation in storing provisions, a harsh cold that killed game, or an illness that swept through the hunters could plunge a whole community into desperation. The Wendigo legend grew from this reality. It was not an invention to explain something unlikely. It was a way of giving shape to something that returned again and again. The process of starvation strips away the body piece by piece. First comes the gnawing emptiness in the stomach, a pain that sharpens with each passing day. Then the body begins to consume itself. Fat reserves melt away, muscles shrink, movement becomes slow, breath shallow. The skin clings tightly to bones, eyes sink deep into their sockets, and every motion feels like it might be the last. Hunger transforms not just the body but the mind. It clouds thought, turns every sound into a reminder of food, every smell into torment. Even the bonds of kinship, the ties that normally keep people close, begin to strain under the pressure. It was in these moments when the human form itself began to look like the figure of the Wendigo, that the line between person and monster blurred. The stories of the Wendigo mirrored the sight of starvation, but they also carried it further. They warned that in the most desperate cases, hunger could drive a person to commit the ultimate taboo, the consumption of human flesh. And in that act, they would cross a boundary that could never be undone. They would cease to be human and would become Wendigo. Accounts of cannibalism during times of famine appear across oral tradition, and even in the earliest colonial records. These were not acts of cruelty or violence in the ordinary sense. They were the desperate choices of people cornered by winter. Yet, the cultural framework of the Algonquin peoples refused to treat these acts as merely pragmatic. To eat another human was to surrender one's humanity. It was to invite the Wendigo spirit inside. The transformation was both physical and spiritual. The individual was no longer kin, no longer part of the community. They were a danger, an abomination that had to be destroyed. Consider the perspective of a family trapped in the snow, weeks from rescue with no food left. The children cry from hunger, their cries growing weaker each day. The parents know that survival may be impossible. In such moments, the Wendigo is not a distant monster in the woods. It is a presence in the room, pressing against the mind, whispering that flesh is flesh, that survival is worth any price. The stories told around the fire were meant to fortify people against that whisper. They said, if you eat, you will not survive as a human. You will survive as Wendigo, and that is worse than death. This cultural stance made cannibalism more than taboo. It made it unthinkable. And yet, the very existence of the Wendigo myth acknowledges that it did happen. By framing cannibalism as a transformation into a monster, the stories allowed communities to grapple with the trauma of famine without collapsing into silence. To say that someone became Wendigo was both explanation and condemnation. It explained the horror of what starvation could drive a person to do, and it condemned that act as a fall beyond the bounds of humanity. The Jesuit missionaries recorded cases where communities executed those suspected of Wendigo possession. These accounts are often described in European texts with shock, but they reveal the seriousness of the belief. Killing a person accused of being Wendigo was not murder, it was protection. It was the only way to stop hunger from spreading, to preserve the community against a force that could destroy it from within. The Wendigo was as contagious as famine itself, and once the line of cannibalism had been crossed, there was no return. In this sense, the Wendigo was more than a monster. It was a boundary marker. It defined what it meant to remain human in the face of the most extreme conditions. Hunger could push a person to the edge, but to step beyond was to enter the realm of the inhuman. The Wendigo stood at that edge, a figure of bones and frost, waiting to claim those who gave in. There is something profoundly human in the way these stories link starvation to monstrosity. All cultures have taboos, boundaries that define what it means to be part of a community. But in the harsh environment of the North, where food scarcity was a matter of survival, the taboo of cannibalism was reinforced with particular ferocity. It was not enough to say it was wrong. It had to be framed as impossible, as a fate worse than death, as a transformation into a creature despised and feared by all. The Wendigo filled that role perfectly. The image of the Wendigo as emaciated, skeletal, and hollow reflects this connection to starvation. It was not a monster of strength and abundance, but of lack, of absence, of the body turned against itself. In seeing it, people saw their own worst fears of hunger externalized, and in telling its story they drew a line: this is what you must never become, no matter how desperate the hunger. Yet the legend also acknowledges the power of hunger itself. To say that a person could become Wendigo is to admit that hunger is not just a bodily need, but a force that can overwhelm morality, identity, and humanity itself. The Wendigo is hunger made visible, hunger given voice and teeth. It is not only a predator in the forest, but the potential in every human being to turn against their own kind when the stomach roars too loudly. The transformation into Wendigo was not always sudden. Some stories describe it as a creeping possession. A person begins to withdraw from others, their appetite growing strange, their eyes hollowing, their voice changing. They speak less, or they mutter to themselves. They become restless at night, pacing, unable to sleep. Slowly, the suspicion grows. Perhaps the Wendigo has taken root inside them. Fear builds, and eventually the community must decide whether to attempt a cure through shamanic ceremony or to end the threat through execution. This gradual transformation mirrors the way starvation itself progresses, step by step, until the body is consumed. The Wendigo, then, became both explanation and personification of the horrors of famine. It explained why some people turned to cannibalism. It personified the hunger that gnawed at everyone in the long winters. And it gave communities a way to preserve their moral boundaries even in the face of desperate survival. To become Wendigo was worse than death. To resist it, even if it meant dying of hunger, was to remain human. What makes these stories so powerful is not only their cultural function, but their psychological truth. Hunger does change people. Modern accounts of famine, from shipwreck survivors to besieged cities, describe the same breakdown of restraint, the same whisper that flesh is flesh. The Wendigo captures this universal truth in mythic form. It takes the unimaginable and makes it visible. It says, hunger can make you a beast, and that beast has a name. But the Wendigo was never only a reflection of famine. It was also a way of warning against greed, even in times of plenty. The same hunger that could turn a starving man into a cannibal could also appear in the one who hoarded food, who consumed more than his share while others suffered.
In this sense, starvation and greed were two sides of the same coin. Both were expressions of imbalance. Both opened the door to the Wendigo. The starving man who devoured flesh and the rich man who refused to share were both at risk of becoming beasts. Hunger was not only physical, it was spiritual, and it demanded restraint. The Wendigo legend thus reveals a deep understanding of the fragility of human society. It teaches that survival requires more than food. It requires boundaries, values, and the refusal to let hunger destroy community. Starvation was a reality the people could not always prevent, but the Wendigo was a reality they could resist by refusing to cross the line into cannibalism, by sharing what little they had, by remembering that to remain human was more important than to survive at any cost. The face of starvation is the face of the Wendigo, gaunt, hollow, desperate, and dangerous. It is a face that looked back at the people from both myth and reality, reminding them of what lay at the edge of winter. And it is from that face that the stories grew, expanding into the grotesque descriptions of the creature's body, each detail reflecting not only fear, but truth about what hunger can do to flesh and spirit alike. The image of the Wendigo is one of the most striking in all of North American folklore, and yet it is also one of the most inconsistent. No single description can claim to be the definitive portrait, because the creature changes depending on the storyteller, the landscape, and the lesson that the story is meant to carry. What unites the descriptions is not uniformity of detail, but the underlying theme. The Wendigo always embodies hunger, deprivation, and excess. To see it is to see starvation and greed carved into flesh, stretched into bone, magnified into terror. Its appearance is not fixed, because hunger itself is not fixed. Sometimes hunger makes a body waste away until it is nothing but a skeleton. Sometimes hunger makes a body swollen, grotesque, a parody of abundance. The Wendigo contains both extremes, which is why it is remembered both as a gaunt skeleton and as a towering giant of the forest. Among the Cree and Ojibwe, one of the most common descriptions is of a figure wasted by hunger, skeletal and hollow-eyed, its skin clinging tightly to protruding bones, its lips are torn or absent, its mouth a gaping wound lined with sharp, broken teeth. The eyes burn with a strange light, sometimes described as glowing embers, sometimes as icy reflections of the moon. It moves with unnatural speed despite its frail appearance, gliding between the trees as though it were part of the forest itself. This vision of the Wendigo reflects the reality of famine, the human body in its final stages of starvation, when it becomes so emaciated that it no longer looks alive. To see such a figure in myth was to externalize the horror of watching hunger consume a community. But other descriptions paint the Wendigo as impossibly large, a giant that towers above the trees, its limbs stretched and elongated, its body growing larger each time it devours human flesh. In these accounts, its hunger is visible not as emaciation but as grotesque expansion. The more it eats, the bigger it becomes, and yet it is never full. Its stomach remains hollow, a bottomless void that can never be satisfied. This vision of the Wendigo reflects the danger of greed, the one who consumes endlessly, who grows larger with each indulgence but never finds peace. To see such a figure was to confront the horror of appetite that knows no end, appetite that devours the world without nourishment. The two images, skeletal wraith and monstrous giant, seem contradictory, but together they reveal the true nature of the Wendigo. It is not bound to one body. It is the embodiment of hunger itself, and hunger takes many forms. Sometimes it shrinks, sometimes it swells, sometimes it wastes away, sometimes it devours everything. The Wendigo is both extremes at once, a paradox made flesh. In some stories, the Wendigo's skin is said to be grey or ash-coloured, as if it has been touched by frost or decay. In others, it is covered with ice, its body stiff and cracking, its joints groaning like frozen branches in the wind. Some storytellers describe it as reeking of decay, the smell of rot carried on the icy wind that announces its approach. Others emphasize its sharp, skeletal features, claws like shards of bone, ribs protruding like the bars of a cage, a skull-like face stretched into a permanent grimace. All agree that it is unnatural. The Wendigo is never mistaken for an animal or for a man. It is something between, something beyond, something that belongs to the forest, but is alien to it all the same. One of the most disturbing details in some versions is the description of its mouth. It is said to be too large for its face, a grotesque wound that splits the skull and exposes rows of jagged teeth. The lips, if present at all, are torn and bloody, as though the hunger has eaten even the flesh of its own face. The mouth is the most important feature, because the Wendigo is defined by appetite. Its body may change, skeletal, giant, icy, but the mouth is always central. It is the entrance to the void, the reminder that this creature exists only to consume. Other accounts emphasize the eyes. They glow, they burn, they pierce. To meet them is to feel one's own hunger reflected back, magnified into madness. Some said the Wendigo's gaze could drive a person insane, infecting them with its hunger until they too became monstrous. The eyes are described as yellow, red, or white, but whatever the color, they are never human. They shine in the dark forest like the eyes of a predator, but unlike the eyes of a wolf or bear, they do not blink, do not dim. They are fixed, eternal, filled with endless desire. There are also accounts of the Wendigo's size shifting in the course of a single story. At one moment, it is a gaunt figure lurking among the trees, no taller than a man. At the next, it looms over the treetops, its arms stretching like branches, its head blotting out the moon. This instability is not a flaw in the storytelling, but part of the terror. The Wendigo is hunger made flesh, and hunger grows. The more it devours, the larger it becomes, until it dwarfs everything around it. Its size is not bound by natural law. It is bound only by appetite, and appetite has no limit. European observers who recorded these stories were often struck by the grotesque contradictions in the descriptions. They wanted to pin the Wendigo down, to define it in terms of their own categories of monster. But the fluidity of its appearance reveals something important about indigenous storytelling. The Wendigo is not meant to be a fixed creature like a dragon or a troll. It is a concept made visible, a symbol that changes form depending on the lesson that needs to be taught. If the lesson is about famine, the Wendigo appears as a starving wretch. If the lesson is about greed, it appears as a swollen giant. If the lesson is about the cold cruelty of winter, it appears as a figure of ice. This flexibility also explains why the Wendigo has endured for so long. A fixed monster might lose relevance as circumstances change, but a creature that embodies hunger in all its forms will never lose meaning because hunger itself is eternal. The Wendigo's body shifts, but its core remains. It is hunger, greed, deprivation, excess. It is the endless cycle of need without satisfaction. Its appearance is grotesque because hunger is grotesque. Its body is contradictory because hunger is contradictory. Its form is terrifying because hunger is terrifying. The towering Wendigo, in particular, reveals how the Algonquin peoples understood greed as a danger beyond the individual. A man who hoarded food during famine did not only threaten himself, he threatened the survival of the community. His appetite grew at the expense of others, expanding until it overshadowed everyone. The giant Wendigo is the image of this danger made flesh. It grows with every meal, its body stretching over the forest, its shadow consuming the world. No matter how much it devours, it always wants more. In this sense, the Wendigo is not only a warning against cannibalism, it is a warning against imbalance, against the appetite that expands beyond control, destroying everything in its path. But the emaciated Wendigo carries its own warning. It shows what happens when hunger consumes the self.
The body collapses, the flesh disappears, the bones protrude. The person wastes away until they are no longer recognizable. This image would have been painfully familiar to those who had seen famine firsthand. It was not an abstraction. It was the sight of neighbors, family, and friends in their last days. To tell a story of the Wendigo as a skeletal wretch was to give shape to that horror, to remind people of the thin line between survival and destruction. What unites all of these forms is the sense of distortion. The Wendigo is never natural. Its body is always wrong, too thin, too large, too stretched, too frozen. It embodies what happens when hunger warps the human form beyond recognition. Its body is the body of hunger, and hunger is never satisfied, never stable, never at peace. The Wendigo is always becoming something else, always shifting, always expanding, always wasting. It is a monster of process, not of stasis. The forest itself adds to this image. To glimpse a gaunt figure among the trees, to hear footsteps in the snow, to see glowing eyes in the dark. These experiences are amplified by the environment. The northern woods are vast, filled with silence and shadow. A figure moving there becomes larger than life, more terrifying than it would in any other place. The Wendigo belongs to this landscape. Its skeletal body echoes the bare branches of winter trees. Its towering form mirrors the pines that loom overhead.
Its glowing eyes reflect the firelight against the snow. The forest makes the Wendigo real, just as the Wendigo makes the forest terrifying. When settlers and later writers borrowed the image of the Wendigo, they often fixed it into a single grotesque form, a skeletal giant with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. But in doing so, they missed the fluidity that made it meaningful. The Wendigo's appearance is not about a single description. It is about the way hunger itself can appear in many forms. It can starve you, it can consume you, it can waste you away, it can make you monstrous. The Wendigo is all of these at once. To understand its body is to understand its nature. Hunger is never satisfied, never stable, never still. The Wendigo embodies that endless, shifting, destructive force, and if its body is terrifying, its inner essence is worse still. For behind the glowing eyes and torn mouth lies not only flesh and bone, but something colder, a heart of ice, a spirit of fire, an anatomy of terror that makes the Wendigo more than a body. It makes it a force that pierces the soul. When people described the Wendigo, they rarely spoke of it in terms of muscles or strength. Its terror was not that of a predator built like a wolf or a bear. The Wendigo's horror was in its details, in the features that seemed wrong, that unsettled even before the creature moved. Among those features too returned again and again in story after story, the eyes and the heart. The Wendigo's eyes were said to burn with an unnatural fire, its heart to be frozen solid, a piece of ice lodged within its chest. Together, they made up the anatomy of terror, a vision of hunger and cold, bound together in a body that should not exist. The eyes were the first thing most storytellers mentioned. In the deep forest, where the nights are long and the firelight only illuminates a small circle of ground, the sight of glowing eyes in the darkness carries a primal fear. The Wendigo's eyes were not the reflective gleam of a deer or wolf caught by the light. They were their own source of brightness glowing from within. Some said they burned like embers, small fires that never went out. Others described them as pale and icy, shining like frozen stars. Still others said they shifted, sometimes red, sometimes white, depending on the hunger that drove them. But all agreed that to meet the Wendigo's gaze was to feel something ancient and merciless staring back. These eyes were not only frightening because they glowed, they were frightening because they revealed the Wendigo's inner nature. Fire and ice, two extremes that destroy, burn together within its gaze. Fire consumes, ice withers. To see both in a single set of eyes was to see a contradiction made flesh, a being that destroyed no matter which way it turned. And more than that, the eyes were said to pierce the soul. To look into them was to feel one's own hunger rise, one's own desires twist. Some legends claimed the Wendigo's gaze could infect a person, planting the seed of its hunger within them. A man who met those eyes might return to his village changed, restless, muttering, unable to eat ordinary food. Slowly, he would waste away until he too became Wendigo. The heart was the second defining feature. Stories often described it as a lump of ice lodged in the creature's chest, replacing the warm beating heart of a human. This frozen core was what kept the Wendigo alive, what made it resistant to ordinary weapons. To kill one required breaking or melting this heart of ice. Fire was said to be the only sure way to destroy it, for only fire could undo the cold at the center of its being. Some traditions described shamans confronting a Wendigo by calling on spiritual fire, a blaze summoned not only in the physical world, but in the spirit world, a heat strong enough to melt even the frozen heart of hunger. The symbolism is clear. The Wendigo was not only hunger, but hunger bound to winter. Its heart was frozen because it belonged to the season of death, when the land itself lay under ice. The frozen heart represented the loss of humanity, the absence of warmth, compassion, or kinship. To carry an icy heart was to be incapable of love or community. It was to be driven only by appetite, cold, and unfeeling. This detail transformed the Wendigo from a mere cannibal into a spiritual warning. To lose the warmth of one's heart is to become a monster. But if the heart was frozen, why were the eyes aflame? Here we see the paradox that lies at the core of the Wendigo's terror. Hunger is not a single element. It burns, it consumes, it gnaws like fire in the stomach. But it also chills, empties, hollows out like ice in the veins. To bind fire and ice into one body is to express hunger in its full contradiction. It heats and freezes. It devours and withers. The Wendigo's body is shaped by this paradox, its anatomy a map of hunger's extremes. In some accounts, the Wendigo's breath carried this contradiction as well. Witnesses said that to hear it exhale was to hear the wind howl, a freezing blast that carried the smell of decay. The air around it was said to grow colder, the snow crunching sharper underfoot. Yet at the same time, its eyes glowed with a heat that seemed to scorch the soul. Fire in the gaze, ice in the breath, together creating an aura of destruction that no living thing could endure for long. The stories of how the Wendigo could be killed always returned to these details. A hunter could not simply strike it down with an arrow or spear. Its frozen heart made it impervious to ordinary wounds. Only fire, the one force that stands against ice, could truly end it. The creature had to be burned until nothing remained but ash, and even then care had to be taken, for its spirit was said to linger in the smoke, searching for another body to inhabit. The fire destroyed the body, but the hunger at its core could never be fully erased. This is why shamans, not ordinary warriors, were often called upon to confront a Wendigo. The battle was not simply physical but spiritual, requiring knowledge of how to deal with the hunger that lived beyond flesh. The details of the Wendigo's anatomy also reflect how the people of the north understood the world around them. Winter itself was a season of fire and ice. The ice covered the land, freezing rivers and burying forests, while the fire of the hearth was the only defense against its killing cold. The Wendigo carried both forces within its body, embodying the struggle of life in the north. Its eyes were the fire that burned in the night, its heart the ice that would not melt. To confront it was to confront winter itself, the endless cycle of hunger and cold that defined life in the northern forests. The contradiction of fire and ice also gave the Wendigo a deeper psychological meaning. Hunger is not a calm force. It does not simply gnaw quietly. It burns, it consumes, it fills the mind with feverish desire. But at the same time, it leaves the body weak, cold, trembling. To starve is to burn and to freeze at once, to feel one's body devoured from within while one's strength ebbs away. The Wendigo makes this invisible torment visible. Its eyes blaze because hunger burns. Its heart is ice because hunger freezes. Its anatomy is a mirror of human suffering, magnified into monstrosity. Other details add to this anatomy of terror. The Wendigo was often said to have claws, long and sharp, capable of tearing through flesh with ease. Some descriptions claimed its hands were skeletal, the fingers stretched too long, tipped with talons like icicles. Its body, though wasted, carried immense strength, the paradox of a starving frame that could nonetheless crush and devour with ease. Its voice was said to be shrill and piercing, a cry that echoed through the forest like the scream of a storm. In every detail, the Wendigo was wrong, distorted, unnatural, a body shaped not by life, but by hunger and cold. To hear these details around the fire was to imagine not only a monster, but the very anatomy of fear itself. The Wendigo's body is a map of extremes, every feature reflecting the contradictions of hunger and winter. Eyes of fire, heart of ice, mouth too large, teeth too sharp, body too thin yet impossibly strong, limbs too long, size ever-changing, breath that freezes, gaze that burns. Each piece alone is strange, but together they create a being that unsettles the human mind because it violates the rules of nature. It is not simply frightening because it is dangerous. It is frightening because it should not exist, because it embodies opposites that cannot coexist, and yet it does. This anatomy also explains why the Wendigo is remembered not only as a threat in stories, but as a presence in the forest itself. When hunters described seeing glowing eyes in the darkness, when they felt sudden cold in the air, when they smelled decay on the wind, they were not only describing natural phenomena, they were describing the features of the Wendigo, signs that the hunger spirit was near. The anatomy became a way of reading the forest, of interpreting its dangers. If you saw fire in the eyes of the trees, if you felt ice in the air when no storm was near, if you smelled rot where no corpse lay, you knew the Wendigo was close. Its body was both monster and omen. To reduce the Wendigo to a single description is to miss the depth of these details. Its eyes, its heart, its breath, its claws, all of these are pieces of a larger whole, a living symbol of hunger, greed, and winter's cruelty. The anatomy of terror is not about biology, it is about meaning. Each detail is a lesson, a warning, a reflection of the struggles that defined life in the North. And yet, for all its symbolism, the Wendigo was never seen as purely metaphorical. For those who told these stories, it was real. The glowing eyes were not just symbols, they were seen. The frozen heart was not just allegory. It was a truth passed down by those who claimed to have fought the creature. The Wendigo's anatomy was both myth and reality, a body of fear that existed in stories and in the forests themselves. From its eyes of fire to its heart of ice, the Wendigo embodied hunger in every detail. But hunger is not only about anatomy, it is about appetite, about what is consumed and what is forbidden. To understand the Wendigo fully, we must turn from the features of its body to the core of its being, the curse of cannibalism, the act that defines its existence and that transforms men into beasts. Cannibalism is one of the most deeply entrenched taboos in human culture, a line that has been marked across civilizations as the final barrier separating the human from the inhuman. In most societies, it is more than a crime. It is an unthinkable act, a breaking of the sacred order that governs what it means to live as part of a community. For the Algonquin peoples who gave rise to the Wendigo, cannibalism was not merely a question of survival or desperation. It was the act that opened the door to transformation, the moment when a person surrendered their humanity and became a creature of hunger without end. To eat human flesh was not just to consume the body of another, it was to consume oneself, to hollow out one's spirit until only the Wendigo remained. The association between the Wendigo and cannibalism is not accidental, it is its defining feature. No matter how the descriptions shift, no matter whether the Wendigo is a skeletal wretch or a towering giant, the core remains. It is a being that consumes human flesh and can never be satisfied. The curse lies not only in what it eats, but in what it becomes. Cannibalism, in this cultural framework, is not an act of survival. It is an initiation into monstrosity. There are stories of families caught in famine, their food stores exhausted, their hope gone. In these tales, someone eventually breaks. Driven by hunger beyond reason, they turn to the flesh of those who have died, or, in the darkest versions, they kill to feed. In that moment, their eyes change. Their body grows gaunt or grotesquely large. Their voice deepens into a guttural growl. They become Wendigo. The act of cannibalism is not just a response to hunger, it is the crossing of a threshold that cannot be undone. In Algonquin cosmology, food was more than sustenance. It was part of a spiritual order. To take the life of an animal was not a simple transaction, but a relationship. Hunters performed rituals to honor the spirits of the animals they killed, acknowledging the balance between taking and giving, survival and respect. To break that order by consuming human flesh was to violate the most sacred bond of all. It was to refuse the responsibility of kinship, to betray the very structure that held life together. The punishment was not imposed from outside, it was immediate and internal. The eater became Wendigo, their spirit corrupted by the hunger they had unleashed. European chroniclers who wrote about the Wendigo often reduced this belief to superstition, but the underlying psychology is easy to grasp. Cannibalism is the ultimate violation of trust. In times of famine, when every member of a community depended on the others for survival, the thought that one of them might consume the flesh of kin was a horror that threatened the group itself. To condemn the act as monstrous, to transform the cannibal into Wendigo, was a way of protecting the community.
It turned an act of desperation into an act of damnation, ensuring that the taboo was reinforced as absolute. The curse of cannibalism was not only personal, it was communal. A single person who gave in to the hunger could doom an entire family or village. The Wendigo was thought to hunt those closest to it first, devouring kin before moving outward. To allow a Wendigo to live was to invite the destruction of the whole. This is why some communities executed suspected Wendigo without hesitation. To kill the cannibal was not cruelty, it was salvation. The act of execution was itself a ritual, a reaffirmation of the boundary that kept humanity safe from hunger's corruption. The curse also carried a spiritual dimension. Cannibalism was not just a physical act of consumption, it was the destruction of the soul. By eating human flesh, a person surrendered to hunger so completely that they became its servant. They ceased to have a will of their own. The Wendigo spirit entered, hollowing them out, leaving only appetite in control. This idea explains why some people accused of Wendigo possession begged for death. They felt the hunger growing inside them, felt their humanity slipping away, and saw no escape except to be killed before the transformation was complete. These tragic confessions reveal that the curse was experienced not as myth, but as reality, as a battle within the self that could not be won. Colonial records include chilling accounts of these moments.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, Jesuit missionaries wrote of indigenous men and women who claimed to feel the Wendigo inside them, driving them toward cannibalism. In some cases, the community executed them immediately. In others, shamans attempted to cure them through ceremony, fasting, and prayer, but the outcome was often grim. Once the hunger had taken root, it was believed to be unstoppable. The person was already lost. The curse had claimed them. It is important to remember that these stories did not emerge in a vacuum. They were born from the lived reality of survival in the north. Starvation was not a distant possibility. It was a recurring threat. Cannibalism did occur, not as a cultural norm, but as a desperate act in the most extreme conditions. The Wendigo belief gave those experiences meaning, shaping them into stories that reinforced the values of the community. Instead of leaving cannibalism as an unspoken trauma, the myth transformed it into a moral narrative. The eater becomes Wendigo, and the community must destroy them to restore balance. In this way, the curse of cannibalism was both explanation and safeguard. It explained why someone would commit an act so unthinkable, and it safeguarded against its spread by marking it as monstrous. The curse made cannibalism more than a practical taboo. It made it spiritual, moral, and eternal. To eat human flesh was not only to sin in the moment, it was to condemn oneself forever, to walk the earth as a creature of endless hunger. This emphasis on eternal hunger is crucial. In most cultures, eating satisfies. Hunger is followed by fullness. But in the Wendigo myth, eating human flesh leads not to satisfaction, but to greater hunger. The more the Wendigo eats, the hungrier it becomes. Its body grows, but its stomach remains empty. It consumes endlessly, yet it is always starving. This is the heart of the curse. Cannibalism does not solve hunger. It magnifies it. It creates an appetite that can never be sated, a hunger that grows with every bite. The image of the Wendigo swelling larger with every meal is more than a grotesque detail. It is a profound statement about desire. The act of consumption, when turned against one's own kind, does not nourish. It corrupts. It turns the eater into a void, a hollow being whose only future is endless appetite. In this sense, the curse of cannibalism becomes a metaphor for all forms of greed. To take what is forbidden, to consume beyond balance, is not to be satisfied. It is to invite endless hunger, to become Wendigo in spirit, if not in flesh. This is why the Wendigo legend endures beyond the literal fear of cannibalism. Hunger itself is universal, so is greed. The Wendigo captures both in one form. Its curse is not limited to the act of eating human flesh. It extends to every act of consumption without restraint, every indulgence that grows instead of satisfying. Cannibalism is the ultimate example, the clearest violation. But behind it lies a broader truth. Hunger unrestrained is a curse, and those who give in to it lose themselves. The Algonquin peoples understood this truth and embedded it in the Wendigo myth as a lesson for survival. The taboo of cannibalism was reinforced not only through law and punishment, but through story and spirit. To break it was not only to risk execution, but to risk transformation into a being despised and feared. The curse was total, leaving no space for justification or excuse. Better to starve as a human than to live as a Wendigo. And yet, the Wendigo was not only a punishment, it was also a reflection of compassion for the human condition. By saying that a cannibal became Wendigo, the myth allowed people to separate the act from the person they had known. The neighbor, the family member, the friend. They were not remembered as themselves after they had eaten. They were remembered as Wendigo. In this way, the community could mourn the person while condemning the act. The curse explained the unthinkable, preserved the bond of kinship, and gave the community a way to move forward. The curse of cannibalism is what makes the Wendigo more than a frightening figure in folklore. It makes it a moral lesson that shaped the survival of entire communities. It is a reminder that hunger can drive people beyond their limits, but that to cross certain lines is to lose everything. It is a curse that does not end with death, for the Wendigo's hunger is eternal. It is never full, never satisfied, always consuming, always growing. To understand the Wendigo is to understand this curse, the binding of hunger and taboo, survival and damnation. But the curse did not exist in isolation. It was part of a larger system of belief that saw hunger not only as a danger, but as a sickness, a possession that could take hold of the mind and the spirit. This is why the next step in the Wendigo story leads us beyond folklore into psychology, into the strange and troubling phenomenon that came to be called Wendigo psychosis, where the hunger of the myth crossed into the hunger of the mind. For centuries, the Wendigo lived in story, in the warnings whispered by elders, in the descriptions of glowing eyes and frozen hearts. But in the encounter between indigenous tradition and European record-keeping, something strange occurred. The Wendigo crossed over from myth into medicine, from story into diagnosis. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, colonial observers began to describe a condition they called Wendigo psychosis, a supposed mental disorder in which individuals developed an insatiable craving for human flesh, even when other food was available. To them, it seemed as though the myth had stepped into reality, turning people into cannibals not through famine alone, but through the grip of the mind. Whether this was a real condition or a misinterpretation of indigenous belief has been debated ever since, but the story of Wendigo psychosis reveals how folklore and psychology can entangle, and how cultural fear can shape even the way illness is understood. The first recorded accounts of Wendigo psychosis emerged in the 17th century, when Jesuit missionaries in New France described indigenous men and women who confessed to feeling an uncontrollable urge to eat human flesh. These early reports were framed through the missionaries' own religious lens. They spoke of possession, of souls corrupted by evil spirits, of communities forced to kill their own members to prevent the spread of the curse. To the Jesuits, this was evidence of the devil at work, but to the Algonquin peoples, it was a continuation of their own worldview. A person overtaken by the Wendigo had to be destroyed, for their hunger threatened everyone. By the 19th century, the reports became more detailed and more clinical. Traders, settlers, and eventually doctors began to use the term Wendigo psychosis to describe cases in which individuals seemed seized by a delusion that they were becoming Wendigo. Symptoms were said to include depression, social withdrawal, refusal of ordinary food, and a growing obsession with cannibalism. Eventually, the afflicted person might confess to family and community that they feared they were becoming a monster. In some cases, they begged to be killed before they harmed others. In others, they resisted until violence broke out. For those who witnessed these events, it seemed undeniable that the Wendigo was not only a story, but an illness of the mind. One of the most famous cases is that of Swift Runner, a Cree man in late 19th century Alberta. During the winter of 1878, Swift Runner and his family were trapped by heavy snow. Though other food sources may have been available nearby, he killed and ate his wife and children. When arrested, he claimed that the Wendigo spirit had possessed him, driving him to commit the unthinkable. To his community, he was not merely a murderer, but a man overtaken by hunger's curse. To the colonial authorities, he was a criminal who confessed freely and was hanged for his crimes. For later historians and psychologists, Swift Runner became the most infamous example of Wendigo psychosis, a man who embodied the overlap of myth, famine, and psychology in the harsh north. Cases like Swift Runner's fueled debate among anthropologists and psychiatrists in the early 20th century. Some argued that Wendigo psychosis was a real culture-bound syndrome, a mental disorder specific to Algonquin peoples, shaped by their environment and beliefs. Just as some societies develop illnesses linked to unique cultural pressures, so too, they claimed, did the Algonquin develop this disorder in which hunger and taboo manifested as delusion. Others disagreed, suggesting that these reports were exaggerated or misunderstood by outsiders who did not fully grasp the cultural framework. To them, the idea of Wendigo psychosis was itself a colonial projection, a way of medicalizing a belief system and turning myth into pathology. The debate remains unresolved, but what is clear is that Wendigo psychosis, whether real or imagined, reveals the deep power of the Wendigo myth. The fear of becoming Wendigo was so strong that individuals internalized it, experienced it, and even confessed to it. This was not simply fear of punishment from the community. It was fear of transformation, fear that hunger itself had become a spiritual infection. To live in a world where famine was always near was to live in a world where the Wendigo was always possible. In that context, it is not surprising that people sometimes felt themselves sliding into the role, whether through psychological breakdown, trauma, or despair. Psychologists who study the phenomenon today often compare it to other culture-bound syndromes, such as amok in Southeast Asia or koro in China. These are conditions in which cultural beliefs and fears shape the symptoms of mental illness, directing them into specific forms that make sense within the society. In this view, Wendigo psychosis was not evidence of an actual supernatural curse, but of the immense power of belief. A person who felt themselves drawn toward cannibalism during famine could interpret those feelings not as simple hunger, but as possession by the Wendigo. Their body, mind, and culture merged into a single narrative of transformation. Yet, even this interpretation does not fully account for the fear and seriousness with which indigenous communities treated the issue. To them, Wendigo possession was not metaphor or pathology. It was reality. When someone claimed to feel the Wendigo inside them, the community did not treat it as madness but as danger. Shamans might attempt to cure the afflicted, but if the hunger persisted, execution was considered the only safe option. The fact that people begged for death reveals how deeply the belief was internalized. It was not only the community that feared the Wendigo, it was the individual themselves, terrified of losing humanity to a hunger they could not control. For Europeans and later North Americans, Wendigo psychosis became a symbol of the wilderness itself, a story of how the brutal environment of the North could break the human mind. Writers and scholars used it to illustrate the psychological toll of isolation, starvation, and cold. In their accounts, the Wendigo became both monster and madness, a figure that haunted the body and the mind alike. But in this retelling, something important was often lost. The Wendigo was not originally about individual pathology. It was about communal survival. To reduce it to psychosis is to ignore its role as a moral and spiritual boundary in Algonquin culture. At the same time, the phenomenon reminds us that myth and psychology are not separate domains. The human mind is shaped by culture, and culture is shaped by story. When people live in a world where hunger is given a name, a form, and a fate, it is natural that their psychological experiences will take that shape. In this sense, Wendigo psychosis, whether it truly existed as a distinct condition or not, reveals the profound truth of the legend. The Wendigo is not just outside in the woods. It is inside, in the mind, in the heart, in the fears that rise when hunger grows too strong. Today, most psychiatrists no longer treat Wendigo psychosis as a recognized condition. It has largely disappeared from the medical literature, seen as a misunderstanding of indigenous belief rather than a universal disorder. But its legacy remains important because it shows how folklore can enter the realm of science, how myth can shape diagnosis, and how the boundary between story and reality is never as clear as we imagine. The Wendigo may not appear in hospital wards or textbooks anymore, but the fear it represents, the fear of hunger, greed, and losing control, remains deeply human. The story of Wendigo psychosis also shows how colonial encounters reshaped indigenous traditions. By naming it a disease, outsiders imposed their own categories onto a belief system that already had its own explanations and remedies. They medicalized what was, in indigenous contexts, a spiritual and communal issue. In doing so, they both preserved the stories of the Wendigo and distorted them, turning them into case studies rather than lived truths. This tension continues to shape how we understand the Wendigo today, as both myth and metaphor, folklore and psychology, story and syndrome. Whether real or misinterpreted, Wendigo psychosis reveals the depth of the legend's power. It shows how belief can enter the body, how story can shape the mind, how hunger can transform not only flesh, but thought. The Wendigo is not only a creature that stalks the forests, it is an idea that stalks the imagination, and ideas can be as real as monsters. To believe in the Wendigo is, in some cases, to feel it growing inside, to fear its hunger gnawing at the soul. That is the essence of the psychosis, and that is why the Wendigo remains one of the most haunting figures in folklore. But the Wendigo was never faced alone. Communities did not surrender to hunger without resistance. Shamans, medicine men, and spiritual leaders stood against it, fighting the spirit in ceremonies and visions, confronting the monster not only in the woods, but in the hearts of those it tried to claim. To understand how people survived not only famine, but the fear of becoming Wendigo, we must turn to those battles, to the ways shamans fought the hunger spirit and kept it at bay for their people. The Wendigo was feared not only as a beast of the forest or as a sickness of hunger, but as a spirit that could press itself against the human soul. This is why the struggle against it was never only about weapons or force. Arrows and spears could pierce flesh, but the Wendigo's power lay deeper, in the hunger that gnawed from within, in the cold that hollowed the heart, in the temptation that whispered during famine. To fight such a creature required more than hunters. It required shamans, medicine men, and spiritual leaders who could confront the Wendigo on its own ground, the unseen world of spirit. In Algonquin traditions, the world was never divided into the natural and the supernatural as outsiders imagined it. The visible world and the spirit world were part of one reality, layered and interwoven. Every tree, every river, every animal had a spirit, and humans themselves carried a spirit that connected them to the larger order. Illness, imbalance, and danger often came not only from the body, but from the spirit, from the disruption of harmony. The Wendigo was one of the most extreme examples of this disruption, a spirit of hunger that twisted the balance of life into endless consumption. To face it, shamans used ceremonies, visions, fasting, and song, weapons forged not of iron, but of spirit. One of the most important roles of the shaman was diagnosis. When someone in the community began to show signs of Wendigo influence, withdrawal, strange appetite, muttering, restlessness, the shaman was called to determine whether the spirit of hunger had taken hold. This was not a casual task. It required entering a trance, seeking visions, and communicating with the spirit world to see whether the person was truly infected. Shamans would fast, depriving themselves of food until they entered altered states of consciousness, seeking clarity beyond the ordinary senses. They would use drums and rattles to focus their minds, calling on spirit allies, animals, ancestors, and protective forces to help them see the truth. If the shaman judged that the Wendigo spirit was present, a battle began. The afflicted person might be placed in isolation, surrounded by ritual protections. Songs were sung, tobacco offered, fires kept burning to drive away the cold spirit. The shaman would confront the Wendigo in visions, entering the spirit world to do battle with the creature directly. These battles were described as fierce and terrifying, not symbolic, but real. In visions, the shaman might face the gaunt figure of the Wendigo, its eyes burning, its heart frozen. He would call on his allies, wielding fire, chants, and sacred objects to strike at the frozen heart, to drive the hunger spirit out. Victory was not guaranteed. Some people were said to be saved, their hunger spirit driven away, their humanity restored. but others were beyond saving.
Once the Wendigo had taken too deep a hold, no ceremony could undo it. In such cases, the community faced a grim choice. To let the afflicted live was to risk the spread of the Wendigo's hunger. To kill them was to preserve the balance. Shamans played a crucial role here too, for their diagnosis carried weight. If they declared that the Wendigo had fully claimed someone, execution became necessary. The killing itself was sometimes ritualized, accompanied by fire to destroy the frozen heart and prevent the spirit from lingering. These battles were not only about individuals, they were about protecting the community as a whole. The Wendigo represented a threat that could unravel the bonds of kinship, turning family against family, neighbor against neighbor. Shamans fought to preserve those bonds, to remind the people of their shared humanity against the devouring hunger. Even when execution was required, it was framed not as vengeance but as medicine, a painful cure for a sickness that threatened everyone. The weapons of the shaman were many. Fire was the most important, for fire was life in the frozen north. Fires were lit in ceremonies to drive away the Wendigo, to keep its cold spirit at bay. Songs carried power, especially those passed down through generations, each word imbued with the strength of ancestors. Sacred objects, stones, bones, feathers, served as links to spirit allies who could lend strength in the battle. The drumbeat echoed the heartbeat, restoring rhythm to the afflicted, reminding them of the warmth they had lost. Each element was part of a larger system of meaning in which the Wendigo was not only fought, but understood. Some stories tell of shamans who went into the forest alone to face the Wendigo directly. These tales describe visions of giant figures looming among the trees, eyes glowing, voices calling. The shaman would stand firm, invoking fire and spirit allies, sometimes even entering into negotiations with the Wendigo, demanding that it leave the people in peace. These stories show that the Wendigo was not always imagined as a simple predator to be killed. It was a spirit to be confronted, resisted, and, in rare cases, appeased. Its hunger could never be satisfied, but it could sometimes be diverted, redirected, or weakened by ceremony. The role of the shaman in these battles underscores how deeply the Wendigo was woven into the spiritual fabric of life. It was not a story to frighten children, not a monster of the night. It was a real force that had to be faced with the full weight of tradition, ritual, and spiritual strength. To fight the Wendigo was to fight hunger, greed, and imbalance themselves, forces that could never be destroyed but could be held at bay through discipline, ceremony, and community. European observers often misunderstood these practices.
They wrote of executions and ceremonies as if they were acts of superstition, primitive responses to madness. But for the people who lived with the Wendigo as a constant threat, these battles were acts of survival. They were not about fear alone. They were about preserving the order that kept life possible in the harsh north. To dismiss them as superstition is to miss their truth. The Wendigo was real, not only as a monster in the woods, but as hunger in the belly, as greed in the mind, as imbalance in the world. Shamans fought it because it was real, and because the people could not survive without that fight. The legacy of these spirit battles continues to shape how the Wendigo is remembered. Even today, among indigenous storytellers, the Wendigo is not simply a horror figure. It is a spiritual danger, a force that must be respected and resisted. Shamans may not confront it in the same way, but the lessons remain. Hunger must be balanced, greed must be resisted, and the cold spirit must not be allowed to hollow out the heart. The battle continues, not in visions alone, but in the way communities remember, retell, and live by the lessons of the Wendigo. The stories of shamans battling the Wendigo also reveal an important truth about how fear can be transformed. Fear alone paralyzes, but when fear is given form and meaning, it can be resisted. The Wendigo was terrifying, but it was not invincible.
Shamans proved that even hunger could be faced, that even the coldest spirit could be challenged. In this way, the Wendigo became not only a monster, but a measure of courage. To stand against it was to stand against despair itself. And yet, for all the battles fought, the Wendigo was never destroyed completely. It always returned in story and in fear, in hunger and in greed. The spirit of hunger could be driven out of one person, but it remained in the world, waiting for the next famine, the next imbalance, the next whisper of greed. This persistence is what gave the Wendigo its power. It was not a creature to be slain once and for all, but a presence to be resisted again and again, generation after generation. To understand these battles is to see how the people of the North faced their harsh reality, not with denial, but with meaning. They did not pretend that hunger could be avoided. They acknowledged it, named it, and fought it with every tool at their disposal. The Wendigo was both enemy and teacher, showing them what must be resisted and what must be remembered. And in the struggles of the shamans, we see not only fear, but resilience, the determination to keep the warmth of humanity alive even in the coldest of winters. The fight against the Wendigo was never only spiritual, however. It was also moral, woven into the rules and values that governed how people lived together. Hunger was not just an individual trial, but a communal challenge, one that demanded restraint, generosity, and balance. The Wendigo, with its endless appetite, reminded people of what happened when those values were broken. This is why the spirit of hunger was not only confronted in ceremonies, but embedded in the very laws of the North, laws that taught survival through morality as much as through strength. In the northern forests, survival was never a matter of strength alone. The environment was too vast, the winters too severe, the unpredictability of nature too great for any one person to endure it alone. What kept people alive was community, cooperation, and the laws, unwritten but deeply ingrained, that governed how life was to be lived. Hunger, the constant companion of winter, was more than an enemy to be feared. It was a teacher shaping the rules that bound families, villages, and nations together. And through those rules, the Wendigo became more than a monster. It became the embodiment of what happened when those laws were broken, when the balance between self and community gave way to greed and desperation. The Algonquin-speaking peoples who lived across the woodlands and boreal forests of what is now Canada and the northern United States understood that every choice carried weight. To take too much food when game was scarce, to hoard when others starved, to consume more than one's share. These were not minor faults. They were dangers to the entire group. Winter demanded fairness. If one family grew fat while another withered, resentment could fracture the bonds that kept people united. And if one person resorted to cannibalism, the horror threatened to unravel the fabric of trust itself. Thus, hunger was not only a physical trial, but a moral test, and the stories of the Wendigo were part of the law that enforced it. The first law was sharing. Food, once caught or gathered, was not the possession of a single individual, but of the group. Hunters who brought down a deer or moose distributed the meat, ensuring that no one was left without sustenance. This was not charity. It was survival. A hunter never knew when his next expedition would fail, when the forest would be silent and the traps empty. In those times, he would rely on others to share with him. By giving in times of abundance, one ensured help in times of scarcity. This reciprocity was the foundation of community. To violate it by hoarding was to set oneself apart, to risk becoming Wendigo in spirit, if not in flesh. The second law was restraint. To consume more than one needed, to indulge appetite without regard for the group, was considered dangerous. Hunger was not only about scarcity, it was about balance. A man who ate gluttonously while others rationed risked more than his own health. He risked the wrath of the hunger spirit itself. The Wendigo, in many tales, was not only the cannibal but the greedy, the one who never stopped taking. By linking excess consumption with monstrosity, the culture taught that restraint was a virtue, a protection against both famine and spiritual corruption. The third law was respect for life. Animals, when hunted, were not taken casually. Their spirits were acknowledged, honored, and thanked. Rituals accompanied the kill, ensuring that the balance between humans and the natural world remained intact.
To waste food, to kill more than was needed, to treat the forest as an endless supply, these acts were seen as violations of order. The Wendigo, who consumed endlessly without gratitude or balance, embodied the opposite of this respect. In this way, every act of hunting and eating became part of a moral system that reinforced humanity against the spectre of hunger. The fourth law was vigilance against desperation. Communities understood that famine could drive people to terrible choices. This is why the Wendigo stories were repeated so often in winter. They were reminders that hunger might whisper to eat what was forbidden, but to listen was to cross a line that destroyed everything. By telling these stories, by embedding them in the moral fabric of society, the people created a defense stronger than physical barriers. They gave hunger a face, a name, and a fate, ensuring that the line would be remembered even in the darkest hours. The Wendigo itself functioned as both warning and law. It was not merely a figure of fear, it was the embodiment of what happened when the laws of sharing, restraint, respect, and vigilance were broken. A man who hoarded became Wendigo. A man who ate more than his share became Wendigo. A man who wasted or disrespected the life of the animals became Wendigo. And above all, a man who ate human flesh became Wendigo. The stories made clear that the transformation was not metaphorical, it was real. To break the law was to lose one's humanity and to become the monster that haunted the forest. These laws were not enforced by rulers or courts. They were enforced by community and by story. Every child who heard the tales by the fire, every hunter who listened to the warnings, absorbed them into their understanding of the world. The Wendigo was not only a monster outside the village, it was a mirror held up to the community, showing them what they must never become. In this way, folklore and law were the same, intertwined threads of survival woven into the culture. European observers often misunderstood this. They saw executions of supposed Wendigo cannibals as acts of cruelty or superstition, failing to grasp that these were expressions of communal law. To the people themselves, they were necessary judgments. If the Wendigo spirit had taken hold, the afflicted person was no longer human. They were already lost. To allow them to live was to endanger everyone. To kill them was not punishment, but protection, an act of maintaining the moral balance that made survival possible. The laws of the cold north were not written down, but they were remembered in every story, every ritual, every decision made in the face of hunger. And at their heart lay a single truth. Survival was not only about enduring the cold or finding food, it was about resisting the pull of greed, of selfishness, of hunger unrestrained. The Wendigo was the name given to the failure of that resistance, the reminder of what happened when law and morality collapsed before appetite. In this sense, the Wendigo was not only a monster, but a teacher. It taught that hunger could not be trusted, that appetite must be restrained, that survival required more than food. It required values, discipline, and community. Without them, the cold would claim not only bodies, but souls. Hunger became the ultimate test of morality, and the Wendigo was the shadow of failure. The endurance of these laws reveals the genius of the culture that created them. They were not abstract codes, but lived truths, rooted in the realities of winter.
They did not deny hunger or pretend it could be banished. They acknowledged it as a constant presence, a force that shaped life itself. By giving it a name and embedding it in law, the people transformed hunger from an enemy into a teacher, from a danger into a guide. The Wendigo was terrifying, but it also preserved life by reminding people of what must never be done. As contact with Europeans intensified, these laws and their stories began to shift. Missionaries and traders recorded them, often misunderstanding their meaning, reducing them to curiosities of folklore or strange superstitions of the wilderness. But the core truth remained. Hunger was both danger and teacher, and the Wendigo was its most vivid form. To grasp this truth is to see why the Wendigo survived colonization, why it entered the writings of settlers and scholars, why it continued to haunt even those who did not live in the northern forests. For when outsiders first heard these stories, they were struck by the power of the Wendigo, not only as a monster, but as a cultural law. And from that moment, the Wendigo began to travel beyond its homeland, reshaped by new eyes, retold in new words, transformed into a figure that bridged indigenous tradition and colonial imagination. To follow this path, we must look to those first encounters of contact, to the moment when the Wendigo stepped from oral tradition into written history, carrying its hunger into a new world of meaning. The Wendigo lived for centuries in the spoken word, in the smoke-filled lodges, and around the fires that kept the long nights of winter at bay. It was a story carried in memory, woven into the rhythm of survival and preserved in the voices of elders. But with the arrival of Europeans, the Wendigo began to leave the circle of oral tradition and enter the pages of written history. This crossing was not gentle. Like many aspects of indigenous belief, the Wendigo was taken up, reshaped, and often misunderstood by missionaries, traders, and scholars who sought to fit it into their own frameworks. In the process, it became both preserved and distorted, captured in writing, but stripped of much of the cultural web that gave it meaning. What emerged was a figure that fascinated outsiders, horrified readers, and eventually grew into a symbol of horror in literature. The earliest written references come from the Jesuit missionaries of New France in the 17th century. They recorded stories told to them by the Algonquin peoples, often with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and religious judgment. To the Jesuits, the Wendigo was evidence of the devil's work, a demon that tempted people into the sin of cannibalism. In their writings, the Wendigo was described as a spirit of excess, a force that drove men to consume human flesh even when other food was available. They emphasized the moral dimension, equating it with Christian notions of sin and damnation, and in doing so, they reframed it within their own worldview. What they often failed to grasp was that the Wendigo was not merely a demon to the Algonquin peoples. It was also a cultural mechanism, a story that enforced values of restraint, balance, and sharing. In translating it into their own terms, the missionaries both preserved fragments of the story and altered its meaning. Other early records came from fur traders and explorers who encountered the Wendigo legend as they moved through the northern forests. To them, it was a strange curiosity, a tale told by the people they met, a bit of folklore to record in journals and reports. Some treated it with skepticism, noting it down as an example of native superstition. Others, however, recognized the seriousness with which the people regarded it. They saw that the Wendigo was not a joke or a simple ghost story. It was a force that shaped decisions, influenced behavior, and even led to executions. In these accounts, the Wendigo began to take on a dual identity, both a strange myth of the wilderness and a terrifying reality for those who believed in it. By the 18th and 19th centuries, anthropologists and ethnographers began to collect more systematic accounts of the Wendigo. They recorded its many names across different Algonquin dialects, its varied descriptions, and the stories associated with famine and cannibalism. But here, too, distortion entered. Many of these early scholars treated indigenous traditions as relics of a primitive stage of human development, interpreting the Wendigo as a superstition born of ignorance rather than as a sophisticated moral system. In their writings, the Wendigo became an exotic curiosity, stripped of the cultural context that gave it depth. Yet at the same time, these records ensured that the Wendigo would not disappear. Oral traditions are powerful, but colonial violence, disease, and assimilation policies threatened to erase them. The written accounts, though flawed, preserved fragments that might otherwise have been lost. It is through these documents that the Wendigo eventually entered the imagination of those far removed from its homeland, becoming a figure of fascination for writers, scholars, and readers across the world. One of the most striking features of these colonial accounts is the way they shifted the Wendigo from a communal warning into an individual pathology. Missionaries and settlers were fascinated by the idea of people confessing to being overtaken by the Wendigo spirit. They saw in it a kind of madness, a psychosis, a disease of the mind. The cultural context that this belief served to reinforce values of sharing and restraint was often ignored. Instead, the Wendigo was reframed as evidence of savagery, of how the wilderness and its people were trapped in a world of superstition and fear. In this way, colonial contact preserved the Wendigo but twisted its meaning, turning it into a horror story for European readers rather than a moral law for indigenous communities. This transformation became even more pronounced in the 19th century when the Wendigo began to enter literature. European and North American writers, fascinated by the idea of a cannibal spirit of the North, wove it into stories of wilderness and horror. One of the earliest and most influential examples came from the Canadian writer Algernon Blackwood, whose 1910 story, The Wendigo, introduced the creature to a wider audience in the English-speaking world. In Blackwood's tale, the Wendigo is less a moral warning and more a supernatural terror, a force of the wilderness itself that preys on those who enter its domain. His story is filled with Gothic atmosphere, transforming the indigenous figure into a European-style monster that embodies the alien and terrifying qualities of the Canadian wilderness. From that moment, the Wendigo's place in literature was sealed. It became a symbol of the wild north, a creature of frost and forest, a horror that haunted the imagination of readers who had never faced famine or winter as the Algonquin peoples had. The Wendigo's meaning shifted once again, from oral lore to colonial curiosity to Gothic terror. And with each shift, a piece of its original context was lost, replaced by the fascination of outsiders who saw in it a reflection of their own fears. The irony is that colonial contact both diminished and amplified the Wendigo. It diminished it by stripping away its role as a teacher, a guide, a moral anchor for communities living on the edge of survival. But it amplified it by spreading its name and image far beyond its original homeland, ensuring that it would survive even in forms far removed from its roots. Today, when the Wendigo appears in novels, films, or games, it often owes as much to colonial literature as to indigenous oral tradition. The two strands are intertwined, and it is impossible to separate them completely. This is why the Wendigo remains such a powerful figure. It is not static. It changes with every retelling, reflecting the fears and values of those who speak its name. For the Algonquin peoples, it was hunger, greed, and imbalance. For the Jesuits, it was the devil's temptation. For traders, it was superstition of the wilderness. For Blackwood and later writers, it was Gothic horror. Each version tells us as much about the teller as about the monster itself. The crossing from oral to written tradition was a turning point, not because it ended the Wendigo's life in story, but because it gave it new lives in new contexts. The firelight of the lodge gave way to the ink of the page, and the monster that once whispered in the forest began to whisper in the imaginations of readers across the world. But in that crossing, something crucial was lost. The sense of the Wendigo as a communal teacher, as a figure bound to the moral laws of survival. What remained was horror, stripped of context, but amplified in atmosphere. To see how the Wendigo evolved further, we must follow its path into literature itself, into the stories that transformed it into a figure of Gothic imagination, a creature not only of indigenous belief, but of modern fiction. For once, it entered the written word. It was only a matter of time before it became a character, a presence, and a symbol in stories designed to terrify audiences who had never known the hunger and cold that gave birth to its name. Once the Wendigo passed into the realm of writing, it was no longer bound to the winter lodges and hunting grounds of the Algonquin peoples. The creature that had once been part of oral lore and survival lessons became a subject of fascination for writers who saw in it a figure perfectly suited for their own literary traditions. The Wendigo, with its skeletal body, glowing eyes, and endless hunger, fit neatly into the Gothic imagination, a genre that thrived on the eerie, the uncanny, and the terrifying. From the 19th century onward, the Wendigo began to appear not only as a cultural curiosity recorded in journals, but as a character in fiction, reshaped again and again to fit the fears of readers who had never known famine in the northern forests. The earliest wave of literary appearances drew directly from the colonial accounts of the Wendigo, especially the Jesuit relations and the stories of traders and explorers. Writers found in these records the perfect material for tales of wilderness horror. To European audiences, the Canadian and American North was already a mysterious and threatening place, vast, cold, sparsely populated, and filled with dangers both natural and imagined. The Wendigo became a symbol of that wilderness, a spirit that represented the terror of isolation, the threat of starvation, and the strangeness of lands far removed from European familiarity. One of the earliest and most influential literary works to use the Wendigo was Algernon Blackwood's short story, The Wendigo, published in 1910. Blackwood was part of a wave of writers interested in the supernatural and the psychological, and he specialized in blending nature with horror. In his tale, the Wendigo is not a skeletal cannibal, but a cosmic terror, an elemental force of the wilderness itself. His protagonist, a Scotsman traveling in the Canadian forest, experiences an encounter with the Wendigo as a presence of wind, fire, and transformation, something vast and incomprehensible that strips away sanity. Blackwood's Wendigo does not devour flesh in the traditional sense. Instead, it carries men off into the night, changing them into creatures like itself, their footprints stretching into unnatural strides as they are consumed by its power. This story became enormously influential, shaping how the Wendigo would be imagined in English literature for decades. Blackwood removed much of the cultural context of famine and cannibalism, transforming the creature into an atmospheric horror, a supernatural presence tied to the alien vastness of the forest. To his readers, the Wendigo was not a warning about greed or hunger. It was a Gothic symbol of the wilderness, a place that devoured human reason and identity. In this way, the Wendigo shifted from indigenous moral law into Gothic metaphor, a change that would define much of its literary afterlife. Other writers soon followed. In the decades after Blackwood, pulp magazines and horror anthologies began to feature the Wendigo as a monstrous figure. Here, the emphasis returned to cannibalism, but in a sensationalized form. The Wendigo became a stock villain, a gaunt creature stalking travelers, devouring flesh, leaving bones scattered in the snow. These stories drew loosely from indigenous accounts, but emphasized gore and shock, appealing to audiences eager for chills. In these tales, the Wendigo was no longer a teacher or moral warning. It was a monster of entertainment, a figure of fright designed to thrill readers around the fire or in the dim light of their rooms. By the mid-20th century, the Wendigo had become entrenched in popular horror. It appeared in novels, radio dramas, and eventually film, often stripped of its origins and remade in the image of Western monsters like the vampire or werewolf. Yet its appeal endured because of its central theme, hunger without end. This theme resonated even when the cultural context was lost. Readers in cities far from the northern forests could still be horrified by the idea of a creature that devours endlessly, that grows larger with each meal, that is never satisfied. Hunger, after all, is universal, and the Wendigo embodied it in its most terrifying form. Literary depictions of the Wendigo also reflected broader cultural anxieties. In some stories, it became a metaphor for colonial fears of the wilderness itself, a symbol of the land resisting conquest, devouring those who tried to tame it. In others, it represented psychological breakdown, the madness that comes from isolation, starvation, or exposure to nature's extremes. Writers used the Wendigo to explore themes of transformation, possession, and loss of humanity, making it a versatile symbol in the Gothic and horror traditions. One of the most striking aspects of the Wendigo in literature is how it bridges the physical and the psychological. In Blackwood's story and many that followed, the terror lies not only in the creature's body, but in its effect on the mind. Characters feel its presence before they see it. They hear the wind change, feel the air grow cold, sense their thoughts slipping away. The Wendigo becomes less a monster of claws and teeth than a force that erodes sanity, a spirit that devours not only flesh, but identity. This psychological dimension helped cement it as a Gothic figure, for the Gothic thrives on the interplay between outer horror and inner fear. By the late 20th century, the Wendigo had become a fixture in horror literature, appearing in novels and short stories across genres. Writers drew on both the indigenous traditions and the Gothic reinterpretations, mixing famine and cannibalism with cosmic terror and psychological dread. The result was a creature that could be many things at once: a cannibal spirit, a forest demon, a symbol of greed, or a force of madness. Its versatility ensured its survival in the literary imagination, just as its hunger ensured its survival in story. But this literary transformation also raises questions about cultural appropriation and distortion. The Wendigo that appears in Gothic fiction is often far removed from the Wendigo of Algonquin tradition. The warnings about greed, sharing, and survival are lost, replaced by a fascination with terror and spectacle. The oral lore becomes horror entertainment. The communal teacher becomes a monster of the page. Yet, even in this distortion, the Wendigo carries traces of its origin. The hunger remains, the endless appetite, the inability to be satisfied, the transformation from human to monster. These elements persist, echoing the original meaning, even when stripped of context. The Wendigo in literature is thus a hybrid figure, born from the encounter between indigenous oral tradition and European Gothic imagination. It is both preserved and transformed, both authentic and distorted. It shows how stories change when they cross cultural boundaries, how a monster of survival lore can become a monster of fiction, and how hunger, as a theme, can resonate across worlds. And as the Wendigo moved deeper into literature, it began to shift again, taking on new symbolic meanings. No longer only a figure of famine or wilderness horror, it became a metaphor for broader human conditions: greed, isolation, consumption, and even the destructive hunger of capitalism itself. The Wendigo's journey through literature prepared it for these new roles, setting the stage for its transformation into a symbol not just of the North, but of human society at large. The Wendigo has always been a story of hunger, but hunger itself is not a single thing. It is the body crying for food, the spirit yearning for balance, the heart reaching for what it cannot have. In the oral traditions of the Algonquin peoples, the Wendigo was a figure of famine, cannibalism,
and greed, a monster that punished those who consumed more than their share and betrayed the laws of survival. But once it entered literature and began to circulate beyond its homeland, it grew into something larger than famine alone. It became a metaphor that could stretch to cover many forms of human excess, many ways in which appetite without restraint destroys not only individuals, but societies. Over the last century, the Wendigo has been read as a symbol of greed, isolation, and even the consuming force of capitalism itself. Its endless hunger has proved endlessly adaptable, reflecting not only the fears of starvation in the forest, but the anxieties of life in the modern world. To understand the Wendigo as greed is to see the way its body embodies excess. In some traditions, each time the Wendigo eats, it grows larger, its limbs stretching, its body expanding, but its stomach never fills. The more it consumes, the hungrier it becomes. This grotesque paradox is the perfect image of greed: expansion without satisfaction, possession without fulfillment. The Wendigo's hunger is not for nourishment but for consumption itself, and no amount of food can cure it.
In this way, the monster becomes a mirror of those who hoard wealth or resources, who take far beyond what they need, leaving others to starve. Just as the Wendigo's appetite endangers the community, so too does human greed threaten the balance that allows societies to endure. In oral tradition, this lesson was direct. A hunter who hoarded food during famine risked becoming Wendigo, his greed transforming him into something monstrous. In modern metaphor, the lesson broadens. The Wendigo becomes the corporation that consumes forests and rivers for profit, never satisfied no matter how large it grows. It becomes the wealthy elite whose appetite for wealth and power expands endlessly while the poor are left in hunger. It becomes the culture of consumerism itself, in which desire multiplies with every purchase, never reaching fulfillment, always hungry for more. The Wendigo's endless growth is the logic of greed, whether in the belly of a starving man or in the engines of an economy that devours the earth. The Wendigo also symbolizes isolation, the severing of bonds that sustain human life. In the North, to become Wendigo was to be cast out, to lose one's place in the community. Cannibalism was not only a violation of taboo, it was the destruction of kinship. The Wendigo wandered the forest alone, cut off from family and village, a solitary figure of endless hunger. In this way, it embodies the fear of losing human connection, of becoming trapped in isolation, where appetite becomes the only companion. Modern readers have found in this image a metaphor for loneliness, alienation, and the breakdown of community in industrialized societies. The Wendigo's hunger becomes the hunger for connection, twisted into something destructive by the absence of others. This image resonates especially in times of social fracture. In urban life, where millions live side by side yet remain strangers, the Wendigo can be read as a symbol of alienation, the monster that grows when bonds of sharing and trust are broken. It represents the individual cut off from others, devouring without giving, living without belonging. Its gaunt figure wandering the forest is mirrored in the solitary figure wandering city streets, surrounded by abundance, yet starving for meaning. In this sense, the Wendigo is not only a monster of the wilderness, but of modernity, a symbol of what happens when humans forget that survival depends on more than individual appetite. Perhaps the most striking modern metaphor, however, is the Wendigo as capitalism. The description of a creature that grows larger the more it consumes, that devours endlessly but is never satisfied, aligns perfectly with critiques of capitalist economies that expand without limit, consuming resources, labor, and environments in the pursuit of profit. The Wendigo's hollow hunger mirrors the logic of growth for growth's sake, expansion without fulfillment, consumption without nourishment. Writers and scholars have used the Wendigo as a way of describing the destructive appetite of modern society, where greed becomes systemic and hunger becomes a cultural engine. In this reading, the Wendigo is no longer confined to the north. It becomes global, a spirit of hunger that drives nations to strip forests, pollute rivers, and devour the earth itself. Just as the Wendigo destroys communities by consuming its own kin, so too does capitalism consume the very foundations of human survival, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. The metaphor is powerful because it draws on the original meaning of the Wendigo as a warning against imbalance. In Algonquin tradition, the Wendigo punished those who took more than they needed. In modern critique, it punishes societies that take more than the earth can give. The Wendigo's transformation into metaphor also shows how myths endure by adapting. Few people today live under the constant threat of famine in the northern forests, but hunger, in its broader sense, remains as powerful as ever. The hunger for wealth, for power, for consumption, for recognition. These are the hungers of the modern world, and they are no less dangerous than the hunger for food in times of famine. By embodying these hungers in the figure of the Wendigo, storytellers and thinkers remind us that the danger is not gone. It has only changed shape. Literature has played a central role in this transformation. From Blackwood's atmospheric horror to contemporary novels that use the Wendigo as metaphor, writers have expanded its meaning to encompass new fears. In Margaret Atwood's essays and stories, for example, the Wendigo appears as a symbol of destructive greed and consumption, a Canadian Gothic figure that reflects the exploitation of land and people. In other works, it emerges as a metaphor for colonialism itself, the endless appetite of empires that devour indigenous lands and lives. Each retelling adds a new layer, showing how the Wendigo can be reshaped to reflect the anxieties of each era. Yet even as the Wendigo becomes metaphor, it retains its core as a monster of hunger. This is what makes it so adaptable. Hunger is universal, and it takes many forms. Whether it is the hunger of a starving body, the hunger of an isolated soul, or the hunger of a system that devours without end, the Wendigo embodies it. Its skeletal frame, its glowing eyes, its endless appetite, all remain vivid images that capture the destructive power of desire unrestrained. The danger of this metaphorical expansion is that it can obscure the Wendigo's origins. In focusing on capitalism, greed, or isolation, it is easy to forget that the Wendigo began as a story tied to real famine, real hunger, real survival in the North. It was not only a metaphor, but a lived reality for the people who told the stories. To respect the Wendigo as metaphor today is also to remember the Wendigo as law, as teacher, as warning in a world where hunger was more than symbolic. The monster that devours endlessly in modern critique is the same monster that devoured communities in oral tradition. Both truths must be held together. The endurance of the Wendigo as metaphor reveals the power of myth itself. Myths are not static. They grow, shift, and transform, taking on new meanings in new times. The Wendigo's journey from famine monster to symbol of capitalism shows how myths remain alive, how they continue to teach, warn, and terrify even when the original conditions have changed. The Wendigo is not bound to the North alone. It is bound to humanity's endless struggle with hunger in all its forms. And as it grew into metaphor, the Wendigo also grew into popular culture, carried not only in literature, but in films, television, and games. The monster of famine became the monster of horror stories, appearing on screens and in books across the world. Its hollow hunger, once tied to survival in the forest, became a spectacle of entertainment. Yet even in these new forms, the essence remained: the fear of hunger that never ends, the terror of transformation from human to beast, the image of a creature that consumes endlessly without satisfaction. From metaphor to monster, from literature to film, the Wendigo's hunger carried forward, feeding new generations of stories. To see how it transformed further, we must follow it into modern media, where its image has been amplified, stylized, and reimagined, becoming a staple of horror itself while still carrying the echoes of its ancient lessons. The Wendigo's story did not end with the fireside tales of the North or the pages of Gothic literature. Like the creature itself, its hunger grew, spreading into new forms of storytelling, new technologies, and new audiences. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Wendigo made its way into the most powerful engines of modern imagination: film, television, and games. Here, it became not only a monster of folklore, but an icon of horror, a figure that could terrify global audiences while still carrying traces of the hunger that first gave it life. What makes the Wendigo particularly suited to these mediums is its fluidity. It can be gaunt and skeletal, or towering and grotesque, spectral or physical, tragic or terrifying. Each adaptation reshapes it, and yet all preserve the same core: hunger that never ends, a transformation that strips away humanity, and a figure that lurks at the edge of survival. The earliest cinematic appearances of the Wendigo leaned heavily on the Gothic interpretations of writers like Algernon Blackwood. In the mid-20th century, low-budget horror films began to experiment with the creature, often presenting it as a forest spirit or cannibal monster. These early attempts rarely engaged with its indigenous origins, instead treating it as another cryptid or bogeyman to stalk the screen.
The Wendigo became a figure of atmosphere, appearing in snowy forests, isolated cabins, or remote hunting camps, where its glowing eyes and monstrous hunger provided the backdrop for horror stories about isolation and madness. As the horror genre expanded, the Wendigo found its way into more ambitious projects. In the 1970s and 80s, during a wave of interest in folklore-based horror, filmmakers began to explore it as part of the North American landscape of monsters, alongside werewolves, vampires, and Bigfoot. Unlike these other creatures, however, the Wendigo carried with it a cultural and moral weight that gave it a unique presence. Its hunger was not simply frightening in a physical sense. It was frightening because it revealed the fragility of humanity, the thin line between survival and monstrosity. Directors used this to explore themes of madness, cannibalism, and the destructive power of isolation. One of the most notable modern depictions came in the 2001 film Wendigo, directed by Larry Fessenden. This film blended psychological horror with folklore, portraying the creature not only as a monster in the woods, but as a symbolic presence tied to human fear, trauma, and guilt. Fessenden's Wendigo is never fully seen, remaining partly in shadow, partly in suggestion, as if to remind viewers that the creature is as much internal as external. The film emphasized atmosphere, using snowy landscapes and isolated cabins to evoke the same sense of dread that Algonquin storytellers once conjured around winter fires. Another significant interpretation came in Guillermo del Toro's produced film Antlers, 2021, which brought the Wendigo to mainstream audiences with striking visuals and a strong emphasis on its indigenous roots, albeit filtered through Hollywood storytelling. In Antlers, the Wendigo is depicted as a towering skeletal creature with antlers, a design that blends folklore with cinematic spectacle. The film ties the creature to themes of abuse, trauma, and cycles of violence, making it a metaphor for destructive forces that consume families and communities. While it takes liberties with tradition, Antlers demonstrates the enduring power of the Wendigo in horror cinema, showing how it can be adapted to address contemporary issues while retaining its core of endless hunger. In television, the Wendigo has also found a lasting place. One of the most influential portrayals
appeared in the long-running series Supernatural. In its first season, the show introduced the Wendigo as a cannibal monster that haunts the woods, luring victims and feeding endlessly. While simplified, this depiction introduced millions of viewers to the name and image of the Wendigo, cementing it as a recognizable part of modern horror culture. Other shows, from Charm to Teen Wolf, have drawn on the creature, often using it as a one-off monster while drawing loosely from the image of the cannibal spirit. These portrayals may be far removed from Algonquin tradition, but they show how deeply the Wendigo has entered the mainstream, a monster that can appear anywhere horror is told. Perhaps the most striking expansion of the Wendigo into modern media has been in games. Interactive storytelling has proved a fertile ground for the creature, allowing players to encounter its hunger not only as audience members, but as participants. In video games, the Wendigo has become a powerful antagonist, a figure that embodies both physical terror and psychological dread. One of the most influential examples is the 2015 game Until Dawn, in which the Wendigo plays a central role. In this narrative-driven horror game, players must navigate a story of isolation, betrayal, and survival, with the Wendigo stalking the characters. The game draws on elements of Algonquin lore, presenting the Wendigo as a curse brought on by cannibalism, but it also stylizes the creature for maximum horror effect. Its design, skeletal, twisted, emaciated yet powerful, captures the paradox of endless hunger, making it a memorable figure for players worldwide. The inclusion of the Wendigo in Until Dawn is particularly significant because it introduces players to the idea that the creature is not simply a monster, but the result of a moral transgression. The curse of cannibalism is built into the game's lore, reminding players that the Wendigo is not random evil, but a consequence of human action. This reflects the original meaning of the myth, even if presented through the lens of modern horror entertainment. The game's popularity ensured that a new generation of audiences learned the name and image of the Wendigo, further embedding it in global popular culture. Beyond mainstream games, the Wendigo has appeared in countless smaller projects, tabletop role-playing games, and online stories. In Dungeons & Dragons, it has been reimagined as a monstrous entity that stalks adventurers through frozen landscapes. In online horror forums and creepypasta, the Wendigo often appears as a cryptid or urban legend, its glowing eyes and skeletal frame described in chilling detail. These digital adaptations show how the Wendigo's hunger continues to spread, devouring not only forests, but entire genres of storytelling. The persistence of the Wendigo in film and games speaks to its adaptability. It can be presented as a tragic figure, cursed by hunger, or as a relentless predator that embodies fear itself. It can be tied to trauma, abuse, greed, or colonial violence. It can be shown as a towering antlered giant, or as a gaunt skeletal figure lurking in the snow. Every retelling reshapes it, but none erase its essence. The Wendigo remains hunger without end, transformation without return, a reminder of what happens when balance is broken. What is most striking is how the Wendigo's popularity in modern horror often circles back to themes close to its origin. Even when stripped of much of its cultural context, it continues to embody the fear of cannibalism, the consequences of greed, and the terror of losing one's humanity. Audiences may not think of Algonquin lore when watching Antlers or playing Until Dawn, but they feel the same dread, the fear of appetite unrestrained, of transformation into something monstrous. The Wendigo's power lies in its ability to embody this fear in any form, whether in story, film, or game. At the same time, the Wendigo's presence in entertainment raises questions about cultural appropriation. Many indigenous voices have pointed out that Hollywood and gaming often borrow the name and image of the Wendigo without honoring its origins or respecting its meaning. The creature becomes spectacle, stripped of the moral framework that made it meaningful. Yet even here, the Wendigo resists erasure. Its core, hunger that grows instead of satisfying, remains intact, a truth too powerful to be lost entirely. The question for modern audiences is whether they can appreciate the Wendigo not only as a monster of horror, but as a teacher of balance, restraint, and survival. The Wendigo in film and games proves that it is not a relic of the past. It is a spirit that will not die, a story that continues to adapt and devour new forms of expression. Its hunger has carried it from oral tradition to written history, from Gothic fiction to digital screens, from survival lore to horror entertainment. Each new form feeds it, ensuring that the Wendigo remains alive in the imagination, its eyes glowing, its stomach empty, its name whispered in fear. And yet, behind the spectacle of cinema and the thrill of games lies the deeper truth. The Wendigo is an archetype, a figure that speaks not only to hunger in the forest, but to hunger in the soul. To understand its endurance, we must look at the way it functions as a psychological symbol, a figure that embodies the archetype of eternal hunger, the shadow of desire that lives within every human being. The Wendigo, with its glowing eyes, skeletal body, and endless hunger, has always been terrifying on a surface level. It is the image of famine given form, the face of cannibalism, the shadow of greed. But its endurance across centuries and cultures suggests that it is more than a monster of circumstance. It is an archetype, a figure that reaches into the deepest layers of the human mind. When modern psychology, particularly the theories of Carl Jung and his followers, began to explore myths and symbols as expressions of the collective unconscious, the Wendigo emerged as a perfect candidate for analysis. It is not only a cultural figure of the Algonquin peoples, but a universal expression of human fear and desire, an archetype of eternal hunger that resonates across societies and eras. To Jung, myths and folklore were not random inventions. They were expressions of archetypes, universal patterns of the human psyche that manifested in story, dream, and symbol. Archetypes were not fixed characters, but recurring forms, figures like the hero, the shadow, the trickster, the great mother, that reflected deep structures of the unconscious mind. They appeared in different guises across cultures, but carried similar meanings, revealing the shared psychology of humanity. The Wendigo, when viewed through this lens, is clearly a manifestation of the shadow archetype, the dark double of humanity that embodies what we fear most in ourselves. The shadow is the part of the psyche that contains repressed desires, instincts, and impulses. It is the hunger we deny, the rage we suppress, the greed we pretend we do not have. In ordinary life, the shadow lurks unseen, influencing behavior in subtle ways. But in myth, the shadow steps into the light as a monster, a figure that embodies everything the culture fears within itself. The Wendigo is the perfect example. It embodies hunger without restraint, greed without limit, the collapse of humanity into animal appetite. It is what happens when the shadow is allowed to consume the self, when desire overwhelms restraint, when survival eclipses morality. In Jungian terms, the Wendigo is terrifying because it is not entirely other. It is us. It is the human being stripped of all pretenses, reduced to appetite alone. This is why it appears both as a monster in the woods and as a possession within the self. The Wendigo is not only external, it is internal, the hunger that lives in every belly, the greed that lurks in every mind. To confront it in story is to confront the shadow itself, to acknowledge the danger of our own desires. The archetype of eternal hunger also connects the Wendigo to other mythological figures around the world. In Greek myth, there is Erysichthon, the man cursed with insatiable hunger who devoured everything, even himself. In Hindu tradition, there are the pretas, or hungry ghosts, spirits doomed to wander with stomachs bloated and mouths too small to ever eat enough. In Buddhism, the hungry ghost realm is one of endless desire, where beings are trapped by cravings they can never satisfy. These figures, though separated by oceans and cultures, echo the same archetype: hunger as punishment, hunger as curse, hunger as the embodiment of desire unrestrained. The Wendigo fits seamlessly into this global pattern, showing that its truth is not confined to the northern forests, but lives in the human psyche itself. Psychologists who study myth often point out that hunger is one of the most basic human experiences. Every person has felt it, and every society has faced the threat of famine. Hunger shapes behavior, culture, and morality. But hunger is also metaphorical. We speak of hungering for power, recognition, love, wealth. Desire itself is often framed in the language of appetite. To eat, to consume, to devour, these words describe not only the body's needs, but the soul's longings. The Wendigo, as an archetype, fuses the literal and the metaphorical. It begins as the hunger for flesh, but expands to represent all forms of appetite without restraint. It becomes the universal fear that desire, once unleashed, will consume the self entirely. Jung also emphasized that archetypes often appear in dreams and visions as figures that must be confronted. The hero must face the shadow, not to destroy it, but to integrate it, to acknowledge its presence and learn from it. In this sense, the Wendigo can be seen not only as a monster to be feared, but as a teacher of psychological truth. It shows us the danger of denying hunger, the peril of suppressing desire until it erupts uncontrollably. By acknowledging the Wendigo within, by recognizing the endless appetite that lives in all of us, we can learn to balance it, to restrain it, to live with it rather than be devoured by it. This echoes the role the Wendigo played in Algonquin culture, where it was both monster and teacher, both terror and law. Modern psychology also sees in the Wendigo a reflection of trauma. Hunger, famine, and isolation are not only physical trials, but psychological wounds. The Wendigo myth can be understood as a cultural way of processing trauma, of giving shape to experiences too painful to speak of directly. When communities faced starvation and cannibalism, the Wendigo became the figure that carried those horrors, transforming them into story so that they could be remembered without destroying the survivors. In Jungian terms, this is a process of symbolization, where trauma is given form in the collective unconscious and expressed through archetype. The Wendigo is not only the shadow of desire, but the shadow of suffering, the embodiment of pain transformed into meaning. The archetype of eternal hunger also resonates with modern anxieties about consumerism and capitalism. Jung himself wrote before these systems reached their current global dominance, but his followers have applied archetypal analysis to them. The Wendigo as endless appetite fits perfectly as a symbol of a world where growth has no limit, where consumption replaces community, where the belly of society is never full. In this context, the Wendigo becomes more than an indigenous figure or a monster of folklore. It becomes a universal archetype for the age of excess, a warning that our collective shadow is devouring the world. Yet the Wendigo remains more visceral than abstract theory. Its glowing eyes, its frozen heart, its skeletal frame, they haunt not because they are ideas, but because they are images that grip the imagination. Jung believed archetypes emerged in symbols, in forms that the unconscious could grasp and remember. The Wendigo's body is such a symbol. It is unforgettable because it embodies contradiction, emaciated yet strong, growing yet hollow, burning yet frozen. These contradictions mirror the contradictions of desire itself, which both promises fulfillment and guarantees emptiness. The Wendigo's anatomy is archetype made flesh, a body that reveals the truth of appetite without end. What makes the Wendigo especially powerful as an archetype is its dual nature. It is both punishment and temptation. It is the horror that waits for those who give in, but it is also the whisper that urges them to cross the line. The Wendigo's voice, said to mimic human cries, reflects this perfectly.
It lures the unwary with promises of relief, only to consume them. This is how desire works in the psyche. It promises satisfaction, but delivers emptiness. The Wendigo is the archetype of that cycle, the eternal hunger that draws us in and leaves us hollow. For those who analyze folklore through psychology, the Wendigo is thus a profound mirror of the human condition. It shows us that hunger is never only physical, that desire is never only personal, that the shadow is never only other. It is within us, around us, and in the societies we build. To confront the Wendigo is to confront ourselves, to face the endless appetite that drives us, and to ask whether we can live with it without being devoured. But archetypes are not static. They evolve, taking on new meanings as cultures change. The Wendigo's journey from oral tradition to literature, from folklore to psychology, from monster to metaphor, shows how archetypes live in story. And in living, they continue to teach. The Wendigo teaches us that hunger is both danger and guide, both destruction and warning. It is a figure of the shadow, but also of survival, reminding us of what we must resist if we are to remain human. And so, as the Wendigo continues to appear in film, games, and modern culture, it does more than entertain. It reveals that the archetype of eternal hunger is still with us, still shaping our fears, still reminding us of the fragility of balance. To see the Wendigo today is to see not only a monster of the forest, but the hunger that lives in every age, every society, every heart. And as we step into the firelight of its story one last time, we must ask what it still teaches us, what warnings it still carries, and why it refuses to die even in a world far removed from the famine-haunted forests where it was born. The Wendigo has travelled a long path, from the smoke-filled lodges of Algonquin storytellers to the pages of Jesuit records, from the imagination of Gothic writers to the screens of horror films and the mechanics of video games. It has been described as a skeletal cannibal, a towering giant, a spirit of ice, a curse of hunger, a metaphor for greed, and an archetype of the human shadow. Each retelling has altered its form, sometimes stripping away context, sometimes adding new layers. But through every change, one truth has endured. The Wendigo is hunger without end, appetite that grows instead of satisfying, desire that devours what it touches. It survives, not because it is a static monster, but because it continues to teach, warning us about what lies beyond the firelight, in the shadows of both the forest and the human soul. What the Wendigo teaches first is the fragility of survival. For the Algonquin peoples, winter was not an abstract setting for a story. It was a real, pressing danger, a season that tested every law of community. The Wendigo embodied the worst-case scenario of famine, the horror of cannibalism, and the destruction of trust. In these stories, survival was not only about hunting and storing food, it was about sharing, restraint, and remembering that to cross the boundary of cannibalism was to lose humanity forever. In this way, the Wendigo was a teacher of law, enforcing the rules that kept life possible in the harsh north. Its story is a reminder that survival depends not only on strength, but on morality, that hunger tests not only the body, but the bonds of community. Beyond the specific laws of the North, the Wendigo also teaches about the nature of desire itself. Hunger is universal, and the Wendigo shows us what happens when hunger becomes endless. It teaches that appetite without balance is a curse, that to take more than one needs is to invite destruction, that greed grows larger the more it feeds. These lessons resonate far beyond the forests of its origin. They apply to any society, any age, any system where consumption threatens to devour community, land, or soul. The Wendigo teaches that enough is a boundary, and to cross it is to become monstrous. The Wendigo also teaches about isolation. In the stories, the Wendigo is always alone, cut off from kin, wandering through the cold with no fire,
no community, no love. This solitude is as terrifying as its hunger. It reminds us that humanity is not only about survival, but about belonging, that to lose connection is to lose the warmth that makes life more than existence. In modern times, where isolation and alienation remain powerful fears, the Wendigo continues to speak as a warning. It tells us that to live only for oneself, to cut ties with others, to consume without giving, is to walk the path of loneliness that ends in endless hunger. The Wendigo teaches as well about trauma, about the need to give shape to experiences that would otherwise overwhelm. For communities that faced famine and cannibalism, the Wendigo carried those horrors in story, allowing them to be spoken, remembered, and integrated without breaking the people who endured them. This is a lesson that extends beyond its origin, showing how myth and symbol can transform suffering into meaning, how story itself can heal by turning chaos into order. The Wendigo teaches that even the most terrifying experiences can be faced when they are given form, that monsters are not only dangers, but also vessels for memory and survival. Modern reinterpretations of the Wendigo teach us about our current world, even if they are far removed from its origins. When it is read as a metaphor for capitalism, it reminds us that growth without limit is destruction. When it is seen as a symbol of consumerism, it warns us that desire multiplied endlessly leads only to emptiness. When it appears in games and films, it shows us that hunger remains one of the most enduring fears, no matter how far removed we are from famine. Even in these new contexts, the Wendigo teaches that to consume without balance is to become hollow, that to devour endlessly is to never be full. The Wendigo also teaches us about respect for culture. Its journey from oral tradition to global horror icon reveals how easily stories can be taken, reshaped, and stripped of context. Yet it also shows the resilience of myth, how even when distorted, the core remains, the hunger refuses to die. This endurance teaches us that stories cannot be erased, that they survive colonization, misinterpretation, and commodification because they carry truths too deep to vanish. But it also teaches us to listen more carefully, to return to the voices of those who first told the stories, to honor the context that gave birth to the Wendigo, instead of consuming it the way the creature itself consumes everything it touches. Psychologically, the Wendigo teaches us to confront the shadow. It reminds us that desire is not something we can erase, but something we must balance. It teaches that the hunger within us, if denied or ignored, can overwhelm us, transforming us into something monstrous. By facing the Wendigo in story, by acknowledging its hunger in ourselves, we learn to integrate the shadow, to live with desire without being consumed by it. This is a lesson as relevant now as it was centuries ago, for hunger takes new forms in every age, and the Wendigo waits in each of them. Perhaps the most profound teaching of the Wendigo is that hunger is eternal, but humanity is fragile. To remain human requires vigilance, discipline, and connection. To surrender to hunger in any form is to risk transformation into something hollow and destructive. The Wendigo does not die because hunger does not die. It returns in every winter, in every famine, in every excess, in every greed. And in returning, it teaches again, reminding us of the line that must not be crossed, the balance that must be kept, the firelight that must be preserved against the cold. When we listen to the Wendigo today, whether in indigenous stories, Gothic literature, or modern horror, we are hearing echoes of the same lesson. Beware the hunger that grows when you feed it. Beware the desire that consumes more than it gives. Beware the path that leads away from community and into isolation. The Wendigo is not only a monster of the forest, it is a mirror of ourselves, showing what we might become if we forget the laws of balance. And so, beyond the firelight, the Wendigo still waits. It waits in the forests, in the hunger of famine, in the greed of markets, in the loneliness of isolation, in the shadows of our own minds. It teaches by terrifying, warns by embodying, endures by changing. What it still teaches us is simple and yet endlessly difficult. To remain human, we must resist the hunger that would devour us. We must share, restrain, connect, and remember. If we do not, we may find ourselves wandering alone in the snow, eyes burning, heart frozen, stomach empty, transformed into the very monster we feared.